The Runesmith. Chapter 81 Tier 2 Class. The sounds of vomiting filled a closed-off room. In it, there were many smithing tools along with scribbles of runic patterns on the walls. This was Roland's workshop that he had hidden away in while going through his Tier 2 ascension ritual. After it was over, he found himself affected by the strain of going through those tests. In the regular world, the use of a class-changing crystal was almost instantaneous. It didn't seem like more than a few seconds had passed. Reality was different though. The moment he was out, his brain was jolted with new information. It was like every stressful emotion from all that fighting and then skill learning was condensed into one moment. This caused Roland not only to chuck up his dinner into the bucket that he had previously gotten but also to pass out. He woke up to a characteristic stench that he recalled from some of the parties he was in his previous life. The bucket he used had spilled and the whole place was a mess. His workshop was lit up thanks to his mana generator, but he wasn't sure for how long he was out. The first thing that had to be done was to get a new change of clothes and then to clean this mess. Roland decided to move upstairs. For now, he grasped the door and was surprised by how much lighter it felt. It was a reinforced steel door that he made to resist heavy impacts. It was also very heavy so that normal people wouldn't be able to open it alone. This already signaled him that he had made it through into the second tier. Before checking his new status, a change of clothes was in order, but then he was quick to take a peek. To his surprise, there was quite the change in his stats. Name: Roland Arden, L76. Classes: T2 Runesmith Lord, L1 Primary. T1 Mage, L25 Secondary. T1 Runic Mana Scribe, L25X. T1 Runic Blacksmith, L25 Tertiary. HP: 2405/2405. MP: 7259/7259. SP: 3276/3276. Strength: 64. Agility: 45. Dexterity: 92. Vitality: 64. Endurance: 73. Intelligence: 123. Willpower: 112. Charisma: 17. Luck: 10. The Runesmith Lord class was now at the first level after he went through the trial. He remembered his old stat allocation and noticed that each of his stats went up by 5 points. This was with the exclusion of luck and charisma, as those two acted on different rules. Another interesting thing was that he was able to have 2 subclasses active instead of just one. His blacksmith and mage class passives were still working and boosting his mana and stamina reserves. Even with this, it didn't account for the massive increase in his MP, HP, and SP that he was seeing. After going through a few other status screens, he figured why this was the case. Runesmith Lord. Class. This class gives a 40% bonus to HP, MP, SP. Mana costs of using runes and rune-related skills is lowered by 30%. Tier 2, Lord. Trait. Adds a multiplier of 2 to all of the basic stats with the exception of luck and charisma. First was his new class. It immensely increased all of his stat points like health, mana, and stamina. He was also getting something similar to his rune mastery skill that lowered the mana cost for runes and rune-related skills as well. So not only would he be able to cast more runic spells, but the cost for runesmithing would be lowered. The other thing was his Tier 2 multiplier trait. It was also not a regular trait multiplier, as normal classes had it all at a 1,5 times. This meant that he would outperform regular Tier 2 class holders even with lower numbers on his side. The points he got after reaching the first level of his Runesmith Lord class were also quite high. In previous cases something like this wasn't the case. Did this mean that he would be getting that high of a number of stat points at each level? Roland wasn't sure about that. From what he knew, Tier 2 classes did gain more of those points, but not by this much. It could have just been some kind of bonus for reaching this tier. Only when he reached the second level he would know for sure. There was also a change to most of his regular skills. Identify L9 Analyze L1 BASIC Mana Shaping L9 Mana Shaping L1 BASIC Mana Regulation L9 Mana Regulation L1 Basic Rune Mastery L9 Rune Mastery L1 BASIC Rune Craft L9 Rune Craft L1 BASIC Runic Blacksmith Size L9 Runesmith Lord Size L1. Most of them turned into more advanced skills. All of the skills that were at the 9th level had gone through a change. Each and every one of them was now at the first level of a more advanced version. Most of them just lost the basic prefix, but some turned into other skills. Like his Identify skill was now the Analyze skill, his blacksmithing eyes made a change too. After going through that library of books in the trial, he knew why. Roland removed his dirty shirt and started to fill up his tub made from iron. He did finally manage to make himself that hot tub that he dreamed about. The mess downstairs would have to wait. Taking a bath was the first thing he needed to do. While at it, he grasped one of his old runic wands to test one of his new and improved skills. His eyes started glowing in a deep purple color as he looked at the runic structures. With a bit of concentration, he was somehow able to zoom in on one of the components. Then he saw it, there was some strange code in there. It reminded him of the programming language from his old college days. Hat. A smirk appeared on his face as he tossed the piece of metal to the side. In that library, the focal point was this code. In reality, it was something akin to a magic language that could be changed and turned to fit the user's preference. During the trial he learned some basics of it. With it he would now be able to change the insides of the runic components. In the past, he had to be creative with the placement of the hardware, but now he would be able to change the software to produce more unique effects. He might even be able to create more smart kind of weapons or more universal ones while being able to reduce the size of the runic components. This might reduce the strain on the metallic components and give him some room to innovate. Besides the improvement to his runic blacksmith eyes, he had gained another useful skill. Basic Rune Mending skill. Allows instantaneous repair of damaged runes. This skill might have seemed like it was just regular rune crafting and not much different than regular repairs that he was already able to do. But in reality, it was different. It would allow him to mend used up runes from his gear on the fly and without the use of a hammer. The mana usage was quite high, but with all his passives lowering it and his own large mana pool, it would be quite handy. If any of his weapons ran out of runic charges, he would be able to repair them in an instant. Thus one of his biggest weak points of running out of charges would be fixed with this one skill. There was also another skill that he received, which was heat resistance. This was a lesser form of the fire resistance skill and allowed him to somewhat cope with high temperatures. From what he knew, it would level up the longer he stayed in areas with high temperature, and this skill could transform to the proper fire resistance later on. This would come in handy for the dungeon that was heating up at the lower levels. It was time to not look at the system screens. He found himself dozing off in the hot tub that was heated by his runic generator. Now with his new skills and increased knowledge, he would have to go over the whole thing again. This was a challenge for another day, as he found himself falling asleep in the tub and waking up a few hours later while almost drowning. After a cleaning drive and sleeping, he was good to go. With this, he was now a proper member of society. In this world, before you reached the second tier you weren't considered a respected adult. He would also be able to get a silver adventurer grade now, of course after passing a little test and paying a small fee. The guild was laxer on the bronze and steel adventurers, but from silver, they got involved more. This was the first larger bump in the road of an adventurer. When he advanced to steel grade he didn't really need to do much, it went up just by him continuing to kill monsters and doing missions. With the advancement to silver grade, the guild would now get involved. Wonder what kind of mission they will give me. Roland was now down in his workshop. He was still getting used to his increased strength and agility. His stats didn't look like they went up by much, but with the 2-time multiplier, he was twice as strong and fast. He was thinking about going to the guild. Getting a better adventurer grade brought some advantages besides prestige. The biggest one being better prices when selling or buying items from the guild directly. There was also another thing that he would like to do now. After being done with his advancement, he needed fitting weapons and armor to go with it. His armor and weapons were made from good quality steel, but that was it. It was time to move on from this and try something from the top shelf. He was going to produce his own deep steel weapon and armor. He had procured some raw materials for this cause, but there wasn't quite enough. It was time to go back to town. The new adventurer rank could wait. It wouldn't really lower the prices on the market for crafting materials. It would mostly aid him in selling mana stones and monster parts, or when buying items like health potions for the dungeon expeditions. Roland grabbed his things and after locking up was on his way towards town while riding his runic bicycle. When he was close enough, he just hopped off and placed it back into his spatial backpack. He needed something with an increased width to get the whole thing in. At the gate he saw some familiar faces. The guards knew him as someone that lived here, so they didn't even look at his identification anymore. A lot of things had changed in this town. For one thing, it was now called a city and the number of people had more than doubled. The houses that were being built and renovated when he arrived the first time were now all finished. The construction stretched out further now as new people were coming and new buildings to house them were needed. Roland was rarely seen in this city, and now with a lot of people living here, he was just someone that blended into the crowd. There wasn't anyone that he had made a deeper connection with here. The ones that interacted with him were mostly merchants and vendors. The only thing resembling social interaction that he got here was bartering. Should I check out the usual store or go to the auction house? A big chunk of his money came from selling mana stones or rare monster parts, but the most he made was from reselling runic items. Those were either all handcrafted by him or just pre-made items from other craftsmen or ones he found in dungeons. Roland mostly attached a mana stone to go with it, as that was an easy way to boost the item's price immensely. What type of mana stone came with the weapon and piece of equipment was also important. Putting a stone that boosted a person's intelligence on a heavy hammer that was meant for a warrior wouldn't go over well. Roland mostly went with weapons. It was easy to attach one of the mana stones to the hilt. There were also no return policies here, so he wouldn't need to worry if he did a sloppy job. He was someone that understood how good branding brought the long-term profits later on. With that in mind, his wares had a new logo that wouldn't associate him with his old scroll-making days. This time around it was a blacksmith's hammer inserted into a sun, which gave a similar feeling to the old logo but was different enough for others to not connect the two. The fees and costs for the materials were higher than what they were at Edelgard. He could sell them at a higher price here though. With all the dungeon monsters parts selling well, the adventurers had a lot of buying power. This caused everything to somewhat equal itself out and he was able to make a good living. The brand name he was hoping to embed into the minds of his sellers wasn't quite there yet. Due to doing a lot of adventurer work along with the creation of his mana generator, there wasn't enough time to build other things. Even the armor that he was using for his own protection was just a high-grade steel product that he bought instead of making it. "Good day, did you bring some new enchanted items today?" An older man called out to him. He was now at the auction house. He had been selling things on it since it opened on a semi-regular basis. Thanks to the items always having high or highest grade runes, they sold at a high price and the auction house could make quite the profit. "Yes, today the master enchanted a couple of things." He took out a couple of daggers and steel swords from his spatial bag. He gave it to this man's assistant that started placing them in an orderly fashion on the table. This old man was this auction house's appraiser. They worked similar to the workers in Edelgard. He already made a name for himself, so he didn't have to wait in line. Even without him having to hide it, they took him for an apprentice blacksmith. No one would believe that a 16-year-old like him was a Tier 2 runesmith. This worked in his favor for multiple reasons, and it also let him explain all the runic traps placed around his house to the masses. "Here you go, the earnings for this month." Roland nodded as he was handed a hefty sack of coins. He didn't need to look inside of it. With his mathematical skills he was able to tell how much gold and silver there was in there. It was quite the hefty sum, but he was going to go buy some raw deep steel, so this would probably not be enough to cover it all. "Thank you, I'll see you next time." Anything, in particular, I should tell my master. Sometimes the auction house people would give him tips on what was selling well. Daggers and swords were one of the weapons that sold the most around here. Everyone liked to be either a roguelike agility-based class or a sword-wielding warrior. Nothing in particular but deep iron or mithril weapons are selling well since some gold adventurers came to town. We should be having some skill books related to runes, maybe the good master would be interested in that. He perked up at the mention of runic books. He still needed to gain some insider knowledge for smelting the magical metals that had mana stones as ingredients. It looked nice to have armor laced with shiny gems, but if someone bashed them in, then they would lose their effect. There was a certain time where he tried to smelt some mana stones with small amounts of deep iron, but the product didn't pan out. He would probably need a corresponding skill or some kind of golden ratio to get this working. After a little chat about the city market, he left. The auction employee always pestered him about making better items made from rarer quality materials. Now, after classing up to a Tier 2 runesmith lord, he might actually be able to create such things. The next stop would be another large store. This one was created for all the craftsmen in the city and held all of the resources that one might want. There were even shipments of mithril that could be gotten at a really high price that was still a bit above his pay grade. Roland was now standing outside this building. In his head he was doing some math. He needed to consider how much money it would be necessary to spend. Even if he went over his budget a bit, he could probably salvage the excess material in one way or another. While walking past the door, he found himself not paying attention. Due to this, he didn't notice a person walking out. The two bumped into each other. With these increased stats, he didn't feel much of an impact, but that wasn't the case for the person he walked into, as he tumbled backward after giving out a rather silly yelp. "Oh, sorry about that." He snapped out of it and looked down. He saw a youth that was about his age, maybe slightly older, but it was hard to tell due to his unique facial features. From the first look, the young man looked to be similar to a dwarf, but after looking at his body you'd think otherwise. He was obviously larger and also slimmer than a dwarf, which made him look like a mix between two races. The other characteristic thing that he noticed was the comedically large backpack that he was wearing. It looked to be one of those enchanted ones where you could fit in many items in, but there were even some tools hanging out from the many side pockets to boot. "I'm sorry." The young man started apologizing while squirming on the ground. It looked like he had trouble standing up due to the weight of the backpack. Roland stood there without doing much for a moment before leaning down and grasping the young man by the shoulders and lifting him up. With his now increased strength, this was quite easy. It felt like he was lifting up a child, even though his target was close to 170 centimeters of height. After more apologizing, he was gone and out of the store. Roland just scratched his head and moved inside. It was time to spend quite a big sum of money on his new gear. Chapter 82 Runic Gauntlet. A certain runic craftsman was speeding back home with a large backpack strapped to his back. He was sitting on his runic bicycle, to which people that were going back from the dungeon farming still weren't used to. He had just gone through some of his savings to buy up crafting resources, most of them being from the top shelf and meant for people at the Tier 2 classes. It wasn't that easy to procure everything he wanted in just one day. After going back and forth several times and waiting a few days, he was finally ready to give his new crafting skills a try. Roland didn't just sit on his hands through this time. While everything was being sorted out at the stores, he was busy with his research. There was his new mending skill. He had tested its applications in combat. It sounded really good at first. Being able to repair runes on the fly was probably everyone's wet dream that owned a limited-use runic weapon. There was one big drawback: it just used up a massive amount of mana. Even with all the skills that allowed him to lower the requirements for any runic skills, it took out quite a chunk. It would certainly not be possible to just continually use this skill. There was also another problem: the runic structure degraded with each time it was mended. Roland attributed this to the skill's low level. He gave it a test, and after 2 uses a rune that was rated at highest degraded to high. There were some drawbacks, but it would extend the uses of these runes during prolonged combat. While being a somewhat hybrid class like this, Roland also intended to purchase any mana-related skills that would boost his regeneration even further. The constant headaches he got when his mana ran low was something that he didn't want to have to put up with anymore. Then there was the upgraded version of his runic blacksmith's eyes that was the runesmith lord's eyes. The previous version only let him see some imperfections during crafting, thus allowing him to be able to avoid or fix them during the crafting process. Now on the other hand, this skill had more features while also retaining all of the previous benefits. The most interesting characteristic of this skill was allowing him to peek at the inside workings of the runes. To someone new, it would look like some chicken scratch of strange symbols and numbers, but he could tell that it was very similar to a programming language. Previously he was only able to work on the hardware, now on the other hand he was able to fiddle around with the software. The strange symbols with time started making sense as they looked similar to computer code. With this skill active, his rune crafting also evolved as he was able to alter this language. The biggest problem now was figuring out more of the commands that he would be able to use. His class change gave him some basics, but most of it still remained to be checked. For now, he was able to segregate this code into two sections. One was different and quite familiar to him, as it was just magical language that a regular mana scribe would use for making magic scrolls. It looked like the runes also used this universal magic language in their structures, but it was buried deep inside their software. These spell structures were just regular basic spells. It wasn't hard to figure out which parts he could copy and paste to get an effect. For instance, he was able to replace a spell structure that was for an easy light spell with one with a different color. The rest of the runic components were the same, so it activated without a problem. Previously he would need to find a corresponding rune and exchange the whole large component. Now on the other hand, he would be able to fiddle around with the code and alter it. This was possible on an already created magical item. He had a good idea how to use such a thing in combat. If he placed a flame sword rune on his sword, he might be able to change its elemental characteristic to something else. Through some changes in the coded spell, a flame sword could change into an ice sword. This would help him out tremendously against enemies with specific weaknesses. If he ran into a monster that was resistant to fire, he could just switch it to something else. It also didn't require that much hammering and mana force to change the code, which made this plausible yet not that probable. There were certain aspects during combat that would make concentrating on changing runes quite hard. Exchanging runic code could potentially ruin the whole item if it was done in an unfocused state. There was an option to get around that though. This would be by including more code in the rune from the start. He would need to just give a jolt into the runic system of which code he wanted to use. It would be similar to old programs from his world with pre-programmed commands. If he learned the ins and outs of this magical programming language, he might even be able to make a multi-spell structure. Maybe he could switch between a massive array of spells while not having to cover his crafted items with so many runes. While Roland's head was filled with future research and innovations, he finally arrived at his house. The backpack he was wearing was a spatial item and he needed it to be larger to insert more crafting materials into it. After getting inside, he placed his bike into his shed that he then closed up. While being here himself, he wasn't that worried if someone would try breaking in and stealing his stuff. Even less now after he crossed the Tier 2 threshold. With the Tier 2 boost that was above regular classes, he was already stronger than most adults in this world. He made his way down into his workshop and started unpacking. Today he would be making a specific part of his armor, mainly the gauntlets. They would be made from a special monster leather glove that he would cover in deep steel. It wouldn't quite reach up to his elbow as the part that covered the arms was separate. Roland considered just purchasing a set of completed deep steel armor, but the costs were quite high. This material was mostly sold with completed generic enchantments or runic ones that increased the price even more. He tried asking around, but all the smithies were busy with their own work. He would need to wait months, even up to half a year, to get a fresh suit of armor with no enchantments on it. Then also contend with erasing all the old enchantments, which would cause loss of materials. By making his own stuff, he would also increase the levels of his skills. It was also good to train skills, with them maxed out there was a possibility for other class options being unlocked to him. Sometimes even some hidden skills required a certain skill to be at a given level before it became available. This was also what he would be doing for a week or two. A person without any smithing skills would need a lot longer, but with skills and eyes that told him where to strike it would be much easier. Though they were just fresh level 1 skills at the moment, Roland didn't set his expectations too high. This would be his very first combat armor that he would make, and it would also probably be the worst one that he produced. The only good part about this was that he could fiddle around with the runic programming later without much damage to the prepared armor. After pushing his reinforced door open with one hand, he was now in his workshop. To the side was a board with a diagram of his new armor. It wasn't anything special, just regular looking plate mail armor that would need an arming jacket to go with it. This type of armor would require a lot of belts and straps to attach to his legs. It would also have some unarmored spots behind him, but he was mostly looking to protect his front side. He already dreaded the thought of putting it on and off by himself, but he didn't really have a working design for anything else. Maybe in the future, he could use some kind of magnet design where the armor parts would connect to each other by magical means. It was finally time to get to work. Roland started taking out all the parts that he would need for his gauntlet design. Most of it consisted of thinner blocks of metal akin to sheet metal but slightly thicker. With the correct design in place, he would just need to cut it into the correct shapes and then attach it to the monster leather glove. Something like this could be bought for cheap. There were many armor designs in this world that already had gone through a lot of changes. Each blacksmith always gave their own a slightly different design, but in the end, it was mostly the same type of armor. Roland was planning to go with a flame design for his. It would go well with the crimson color that he liked to use. After placing all the raw resources on the table, he started grabbing the tools that he would be requiring. Some heating up in his runic forge would be required even with the thinner metal pieces. Deep steel was a lot harder to work with than regular steel and a lot more resistant. Without heating it up in magical flames to soften it up, it would be quite a difficult task. The mana added a few strange qualities to the metals in this world, thus some old crafting methods went out of the window. Luckily he had a few modernized tools already prepared. Punching holes was now a thing of the past as he built himself a nice drill. Making the drill bits was a bit tedious, and he also had to make some from deep iron and steel. The old slave collars helped with that part as he had melted them down to recycle them as some of his current tools. His new crafting hammer was also made from them. Crafting the runes on this piece of armor would come last. It was slightly easier as the metal could be heated up without it being damaged even after it was hammered into shape. After having prepared everything, it was time to get to work. He put on his blacksmithing apron that he got cheaply off the market along with his protective goggles. Thanks to his smithing eyes, he wouldn't need to draw out the shapes on the metal during the cutting process. This skill somehow allowed him to see the diagram that he was currently working on and be able to follow it. This time around he wouldn't need any heavy-duty scissors or chisels to cut up the metal. He had a somewhat modern saw already prepared. It didn't look like much at first glance as it was a thicker piece of metal with a side circular saw connected to it. It had a wire at the end that connected to his generator room. After giving it a little jolt with his own mana, the runic circular saw activated without a problem. This model looked similar to its modern counterpart, but it lacked any buttons. It also had a blade guard made from metal that protected his fingers from being sliced off. The piece of thinner metal that was heated up in the forge was placed in a vise. Following this, Roland started cutting into it to get the proper shape that was needed for the gauntlet finger parts. Soon many small pieces of cut deep steel were being placed on a side workbench. Before working on them more, they would need polishing. Even with the modern saw, there were sharp edges left here and there that needed to be smoothed out. For this, he could use his grindstone that had also been connected to his generator. He was already ahead with his work by not needing mana on these runic power tools. The next step was bending the pieces that would be later fitted onto the fingers of his gauntlet. For this he needed a metal bending jig. This consisted of a pipe that was cut in half and another one that would be pushed down into it. Roland needed to place the metal cutouts into this bending jig and press them down with the other pipe to bend. Before doing this he also needed to heat them up, as deep steel wouldn't be that easy to get into shape. If something was out of shape, he would use his ball-peen hammer. The round side of the hammer could also make spherical shapes and could be used instead of the bending jig. This was quite a lengthy process, as there were 10 fingers that he needed to fill. With now being independent there was no rush though, he could spend as much time as he needed. Without having to rush to level up now he could take it slow. The next class change could be taken in another 24 levels when he hit level 100. There was also an option to max out this class to level 50 before that, which he would probably be doing as it was some kind of rarity. With more time passing he was finally done with all the small pieces. Now came the drilling part. Previously he would have to punch holes through the pieces via his hammer, but now he had a working drill. With it, the holes were more even and they wouldn't bend the smaller metal pieces during a badly placed hit. Now came the riveting part of the construction. He took out one of the prepared leather strips from the side and placed one of the metal pieces on it. What he needed to do here is connect all the parts that would be the fingers together on this leather strip. This was done by punching holes through the leather strip and the previously cut out holes. When finished the gauntlet would have a somewhat scale pattern. What he now had was something that looked like an armored finger. This he would then place on the leather glove and attach it by rivets as well. He just had to connect it by the holes that were on the fingertip and the end of it. After connecting all of those he would have something that already started resembling a metal gauntlet. Once the finger and thumb pieces were done, it was time for the last phase, the hand. With his diagram, he still had to shape 7 plates of metal for the hand part and also for the vambrace. This would also require a lot of bending and riveting. On the end of the vambrace, he would rivet in a flame design. On it, there would be pre-made sockets for his mana stones to go in. They would be both wedged in by force and also glued in by the special alchemist glue that would keep them in place. This took quite a bit of time and was also a good learning experience for someone that mostly made weapons instead of armor. In the end, he had one of the gauntlets ready for some rune crafting. His whole armor set would have fire resistance put on it as a priority. He knew that below the 10th floor there was a somewhat volcanic section. This with some chilling runes on some parts would help him last through the heat. Even though he had heat resistance now, having more wouldn't hurt. Roland placed the half-finished gauntlet to the side. It had taken him a whole day to get here and there was still some work left. He was certain that the left gauntlet would take him a lot less time. The lack of skill progress during this proved that it was a lot harder to level up those tier 2 skills. After pushing the door open he headed over to the kitchen. There, a pot with water was waiting for heating up. His stove was also running on heating runes, so he was saving a lot of money on resources like coal and wood. While resting he looked outside his window, the moons were already up in the sky. It was one of those times where old memories flooded back. He had been living in this world for over 10 years now. The cult that could potentially be after him still lingered in the back of his mind, this along with the strange events concerning the soldier that almost killed him when he was 10. I wonder what those 3 are doing. He thought back to his first adventurer party that were the first people that were actually nice to him. About 5 years had passed since then. Their time together was quite short all things considered, so he wasn't sure if they even remembered him. I wonder if they really think that I died. Now he thought back to the old Arden estate. He didn't really feel like a member of that family. The child's body that he was inhabiting had some sentiments towards it though. These had slowly been going away with time though now it felt like a dream that had long passed. Think I should take a bath and go to bed, I'll work on the armor tomorrow. He tossed all these old thoughts back where they were before. It wasn't the time to think about old things that had already passed. It was time to move forward, getting this tier 2 class was only the beginning. Chapter 83 Silver Rank Test. A somewhat nice-looking deep steel gauntlet was laying down on a table. Roland looked at his newest creation and couldn't help to slide his hand inside of it. The feeling was quite nice and he could move his fingers around well. This gauntlet that he made was in the glove style. There was the option to go with a mitten design that offered more protection for his fingers. That type of gauntlet offered more defense but at the expense of dexterity. He went with the more dexterous variant that fitted his high dexterity stat more. The right one was done but he still needed to assemble the left. First, though, it was time to perform some tests. This gauntlet was fitted out with 4 common grade mana stones that were at the sides of the vambrace. Thanks to the ethereal pathways technology he would be able to connect all of his armored parts together later. This didn't mean that it was wise to place the mana stones away from runic structures. He attempted to place the mana stones in a hidden structure away from the moving parts while not exposing them to harm's way. But a concentration of mana stones in one place would cause the runic circuits to overload. They just couldn't take the enriched mana output that was injected into the system. Thus they needed to be placed close to the runes they were supposed to affect. He looked to the side where a small plate made from deep steel was just sitting there. This was a part that he used for research purposes. It was in a square shape and in each corner there was 1 common grade mana stone. The whole surface was filled out with runic symbols. He moved his finger towards it to give it a poke. Through his finger, he injected a trace amount of mana to look at the previously pre-programmed effect. This metallic plate lit up in an orange light before spitting out some flames. In a moment an orb of orange light was produced, but this wasn't just a regular flame orb spell. The blob of light started to change shape and soon words started appearing. He looked at the spelled out words that said "Hello World" and thought back to his previous life. Something like this was very common among programming circles, as this was mostly the first thing such a person would create. Before moving on to his gauntlet, he took out a small piece of metal. It looked like a pen made from deep steel with a mana stone attached to the top. This was just a simple device that aided him in rune crafting. He poked the desired rune on this plate and injected his mana. Soon the magic code started shifting into a different structure. The magic writing that was shining orange changed into a blue hue and exuded a more chilly aura. Changing just the code is much faster. It also doesn't affect the other structures, so the runes don't deteriorate. The runic code inside the runes was something that he learned during his stay in that trial library. He had taken some basics from there with which he could now perform such tasks. His understanding was still basic and mostly at the lesser rune level. It would take some time to go through all these runes again. The old knowledge he gained by matching the hardware components started feeling trivial, but it wasn't useless. Those parts were still important to get the highest grade and lower mana consumption while maximizing the rune's power. Such a thing wouldn't be possible by just playing around with the runic code. Is it possible to create some kind of runic operating system? This was the most important question. The code could be copied over after it was inscribed into the runic component. These runes he was working with were like hard drives that kept everything stored. This also brought another problem: he would need to make a lot of backup storage. His intelligence stat made his memory quite good, but even if he knew the whole code, writing it over and over again into each rune would just waste too much time. Roland looked at his created glove and then at the schematic that was hung up to the side. He had already decided on the spells that he would inscribe along with the rudimentary operating system that he would use to switch between spells. In the past, he would have to separate the runic structures into separate armor pieces if he wanted to have multiple spells. That or fit more separate structures on one piece of equipment and then inject his mana manually into the one that he wanted to use. Now on the other hand, he could connect everything into one big grand runic circuit. He would store the pre-programmed spells in strategic locations. If he wanted to activate an ice spell through his gauntlet, he would just jolt the corresponding runic program. The icearrow.exe would then activate and shoot out the spell it was assigned to. At this point in time, this was the most he could do. This wasn't quite that proficient, as with more of those executables the tougher it would be to activate them. It was like opening up a folder and having to manually click on each executable. He would have to do it each time to produce what he wanted, then if something was wrong with the code, the whole thing could explode in his face. There was also one other big weakness of such a system. It would only require his enemy to sever one of the runic traces that went towards his glove. If it was broken, the signal from the program would not be able to go through to execute the spell. The only way for him to then cast this spell would be to use his mending skill to fix the structure or repair it with rune crafting. In the middle of battle, this would be quite a tough thing to do, which would force him not to take many hits. Luckily, deep steel is quite resistant. The runic pathways shouldn't just break that easily, could also attach some auxiliary runes on the inside of the armor. He rubbed his chin while contemplating his design again. He really didn't want to do this again, but he didn't feel like he was quite experienced enough to account for everything in advance. This is going to take a while. He grasped his hammer from the side and resumed his work. Time flew by, and in about a month his creation was ready. Now for the finishing touches. A full set of deep steel armor was placed on his workbench. It was fitted out with runes, and the shiny mana stones were sticking out from a few places. It was nice and shiny as he had polished it to perfection before finishing up. This was also the problem, it was a bit too metallic and out there, but he had just the thing for this occasion. Roland took out a small bottle of red liquid and slowly brought it over to the breastplate and placard. He was sure to let a drop of this strange red liquid drop on the breastplate. The moment it collided with the metal, he could see a change. The whole metallic plate started changing color. From the spot the drop fell, it began to turn into a crimson color. Alchemists sure make some handy stuff. This was an alchemist concoction that was used to color metallic parts. It wasn't paint, it somehow changed the color of the metal it touched. This saved a lot of time as he never had to give it a paint job. His new creation was ready to be worn and tested. He had made it specifically for the silver grade adventurer test that he would be taking soon. There was no way of knowing what they would ask of him, but it would either be a quest down in the dungeon or a one-on-one battle with another tier 2 adventurer. If it was up to him, he would rather go with the dungeon run, as he didn't really want to interact with others or show his hand yet. After the paint job was done, another annoying task was before him. Now I have to get this thing on. He had already worn heavy armor before, but it was still annoying. There were many straps and procedures he needed to follow to get armor like this on. Normally knights that used armor like this would have squires to help them get dressed, but he had only himself. While grumbling, he began putting the whole thing on. He also used some pre-bought chainmail to cover some exposed parts. In time he was ready. Deep steel was slightly heavier than regular steel. Even with this, he didn't feel very restricted by the weight. His stats were already quite superhuman, so walking around in heavy armor wasn't much of a problem. His choice of weapon was an arming sword like before, along with a kite shield. The sword looked like his old sword, but it was made from deep steel. With everything accounted for, he left towards the city, shield on his back and the sword to his side. This time he would just go on foot to see how comfortable this thing was during prolonged walking. He had tested the runic spells before coloring already, so this was the only stress test remaining. The guards at the gate didn't react to him anymore. He was one of the only people wearing crimson heavy armor wandering through the streets. This world had far more peculiar things than men in edgy armor, so no one really thought it was that strange. Even if he changed his helmet to one that looked like a skull, they wouldn't even bat an eye. While passing through the gate, he noticed a party of adventurers walking out. They looked like they were battle-ready, and they had more members than a regular party had. From a quick glance with his improved analyzing skill, he could see their levels. All of them were close to level 50, but none of them was quite there. Probably soon they would be able to reach tier 2 status and just like him take the advancement test to a silver rank adventurer. While passing, he also noticed someone with a large backpack trailing behind this 6-man party. But being a bit preoccupied with his own things, he didn't really care. With some time he was finally at the Adventurer Guild building. On the inside, it now looked like a proper guild with the usual layout and some drunken adventurers inside. The clatter of his armor brought attention to him, but only for a second before people turned to themselves. He wasn't the only armored person that kept his helmet on either. The lines to the receptionist ladies weren't as long anymore and quite free today. He moved over to the line with the elven woman that he got his adventurer card. Even though she didn't work as fast as the woman with the glasses, she sometimes gave him better deals. Maybe today she would let him have an easier test. We are having a 5% discount on all health potions if you buy them as a bundle of 5. He was greeted by a sales pitch right off the bat. The only response he could offer was a shake of his head. Oh, if you're not interested in health potions, then how about mana potions? We just received a new batch recently. The lady sure was diligent, but he just rolled his eyes as he knew that buying directly from the Adventurers Guild wasn't as good as going to a proper alchemist shop. It did save up on some time and sometimes the deals were good. No, thank you. I would like to take the silver rank test. Silver rank test, oh my. Do you meet the qualifications? Before the woman could start listing down the terms that he already knew, he took out his adventurer card. Yes, I am above level 50 and past my class change. Here is my card. I have also done enough missions to qualify for a test. The elven girl just smiled and took the card into her hands. After a small moment she gave a big smile while looking up. Ah, if it isn't Mr. Wayland, almost didn't recognize you. Is that a new set of armor? You look great in it. You sure do love dark red, don't you? Roland just stood there, not sure why the elven lady was talking so much. She did seem more chatty with him than with the other adventurers. He wasn't sure why. Was she interested in him in some way? Or did she just like talking to people that mostly respond in nods, grunts, or very short sentences? He wasn't someone that was that versed in women, so he didn't know, but for now he decided to try to hurry this whole thing up. This new armor of his needed to be tested out in the field, so he hoped he would get a task to descend into the dungeon. Facing off against a tier 2 guild member wouldn't be bad either, but then it would be an open spectacle. Yes, it is new. Could I get my task sorted out? I don't have that much time. Mr. Wayland, you're no fun. The elven woman showed a rather cute pout which took him by surprise, but soon enough she was back to smiling. Please place your hand on the orb. He followed the instructions, but just like last time his status was corrupted. It was somehow visible that he had a tier 2 class, but the elven lady still raised her eyebrow. This status, can Mr. Wayland do something about it? Roland just shook his head from side to side as he didn't really want to reveal his true stats or classes to this guild. There wasn't any specific law that he needed to, so he would refuse. Quite stubborn. Please wait a moment, I'll have to consult one of our associates about your task. You will also have to pay a fee. The Sun Elf lady went away into the back room while Roland waited. He tried thinking about what kind of tests or tasks guilds usually gave the new adventurers. Normally they made a person do some kind of mission that was for silver rank adventurers. Here in this city, with a dungeon that would entail going into the lower levels, probably hunting some monsters close to tier 2 or ones that had already evolved. In about 10 minutes the woman returned, but she wasn't alone. Next to her was a somewhat tanned man. He had a robust build and looked to be in his mid-20s. He had short dark hair and a somewhat cocky expression on his face. Is this the new fledgling you want me to test? Roland got eyeballed hard by this man. By what he was saying, this could only mean one thing. Instead of getting a dungeon quest, he would need to face off against this guy. Yes, this is him. Mr. Wayland, let me introduce you to Armand. He will be your sparring partner for your guild advancement test. This man was about the same height as Roland, which was close to 190 centimeters. His frame was slightly larger and it was obvious that he was some kind of warrior. The other adventurers were quick to notice this as they moved closer. Hey, Armand is going to fight someone. Let us go watch. How long do you think that guy will last? 5 minutes tops. Tests like this were considered an event for these adventurers that didn't really have much to do. They would also bet on the winners or on how long the party that seemed to be weaker would last against a trained guild instructor. Such instructors were either retired adventurers or current ones that took it for a quick payout. I guess I'll have a big audience. He couldn't really refuse to take this test. It would seem strange, and the Adventurer Guild would probably not take him seriously afterward. It was up to them to decide on the test, and he would have to go through with it. From what he could tell, this test would take place in a sort of small arena behind the Adventurer Guild building. This place was something you could rent out to train with others, and sometimes even some sanctioned fights between fighters took place. I shouldn't need to beat the instructor, exchanging some blows should be enough for him to measure my strength, but I'm not sure he will let me off with just that. He wasn't sure why, but the guy that he was facing off against looked quite into it. The guy looked like someone that liked to fight. Normally an instructor wouldn't go all out and just test a newly ascended Tier 2 class holder. Some of these instructors had their own way of doing things though. Please grab a weapon and get ready, we will begin the test shortly. Roland looked at the training swords on the side. He was deemed to be a warrior type and using sharp weapons was forbidden. The armor he was wearing was the more important part, with it on he hoped to get through this test undamaged. Chapter 84 Fight at the Guild. Did you hear? No, what is it? Armand is going to test some kind of a newbie. Armand? Didn't he break that last guy's legs? The same, we should go check it out. I heard his opponent is quite an eccentric. Two men were chatting outside the Adventurer Guild building. They soon moved around it towards the training field in the back. As they arrived, they could see a small crowd of people already there. What are the odds? 5-1 in Armand's favor. We are also betting on how long the new meat will last in the ring. People were placing bets on how long the man in red armor would last against the hired guild instructor. The man was an active adventurer who liked performing these sorts of tests for one reason or another. Other adventurers were just here to see a show, as everyone liked to see newbies getting brought down a peg by more experienced seniors. You weren't lying when you said he was an eccentric. What's with that color, and are those runic symbols? The two men that had come late looked at the man in the red suit of armor. To them, he looked like a son from some kind of rich merchant. Normally no one could afford a full suit of runic armor. They could even see mana stones peeking out, which showed them that it was a more expensive version. This new silver rank candidate was in the middle of picking out his training weapons. He wasn't allowed to use swords that had a blade for safety reasons. Though even without a sharp edge, someone at Tier 2 could easily kill someone with a direct hit from a blunt weapon. The ones performing the test were aware of this. They would be compensated for the danger, and any healing potions were on the house. Armand, that was this instructor, was on the other side. The two were in a fenced round ring of sorts with a lot of space to maneuver. People could see him put on two metallic-looking gauntlets, and a cute-looking lady was helping him strap them in. It didn't seem like the man was perturbed by his opponent that was clad in full-body armor. His face was relaxed and filled with smiles. Will it really be that easy? That guy shouldn't be that weak. Are you stupid? Did you see what they are wearing? Armand clearly has the advantage here. Those gauntlets will dent that armor in no time. One of the men was quite sure that the guild instructor had it in the bag. From this guy's perspective, the man in red armor was clearly some kind of shield warrior, a tank in gaming terms. His armor would be good against weapons with blades but weak against blunt force. His opponent Armand was a pugilist, someone that specialized in close combat with his fists. When those gauntlets landed on the red armor, it wouldn't matter how hard it was, the blows would get through to the internal organs. There was also the agility aspect. The man in the bulky armor would have trouble contending with his opponent's speed. I bet this fight will be quite boring. Either he goes down with a few hits or keeps defending with that shield, but that training shield won't last that long. Tier 2 fighters reached past the human limits. With enough punches a shield made from iron or steel would give out. Yeah, quiet, I think it's starting. The man in the crimson armor went with a shield and a sword. The sword was blunt and would count more as a blunt weapon than a real blade. The only thing that made it better than a mace was its lower weight. It was more of a finesse weapon. The crowd cheered as the fun was finally beginning, even more after they saw the beautiful sun elf receptionist lady there. She would be the one that gave the signal to start the battle as well as be the witness. Everyone ready? The man in red armor nodded and his opponent just shrugged while getting in a lazy fighting stance. He was clearly not taking this training match too seriously. The signal for them to begin was given and people could hear Armand chuckling. He stood there and beckoned his opponent to attack. How about I give you 4 free hits? Think that would be fair, don't you all think? The people that were looking in started laughing as they knew that this man liked to play around with his foes. This was clearly a tactic used to agitate an opponent and make him do sloppy decisions. With what looked to be a heavy shield warrior against him, Armand would find it easy to evade any of his sluggish attacks. Well, what are you waiting for, newbie? Attack me, or are you scared? The man in red didn't seem to be taking the bait at first, but after some more taunts, it looked to have worked. He took a step forward with his shield in front and sword to the side. The people around expected some kind of blind rage-filled charge, and they got something similar. That crimson armor started glowing in green color. This glow was mostly coming from the embedded green mana stones. Anyone that was able to sense mana opened up their eyes wide at this phenomenon. This was just the beginning, as their curious faces quickly turned to ones of bewilderment. The man took off in a sprint, but in reality, it looked more like he was flying forward. The speed at which he was going was not something a Tier 2 beginner should be able to produce. Armand barely reacted by dodging to the side. His expression was similar to everyone else here as he felt something graze his cheek. A long streak in the ground was formed as the man in the armor zoomed by. It looked as if this person had trouble containing his own speed. The greenish glow that the red armor produced faded away, and the silver rank candidate turned to Armand that rubbed his cheek. Even from here, everyone could see that he was bleeding. They weren't sure how, but it didn't look like this would be such an easy fight for this instructor. People started moving closer as now everyone was interested in what this person had to offer. Was it some kind of special class, or was this armor responsible for this sudden speed boost? Only time would tell. Soon the bout resumed as the armored man glowed green again and charged forward. This time around he was even faster. Armand was unable to keep his word and defended himself against the practice blade with his metal gauntlets. A quick exchange of sword against fists took place. Sparks started flying, but it didn't seem like anyone was giving an inch. The clash ended after the pugilist landed a hard hit on the armored man's shield. The impact caused him to slide back, and a small dent appeared on the slab of metal that the armored warrior was holding. This trade-off was followed by a pause. It seemed like the two fighters were about equal, but the man in the red armor didn't take any hits. He managed to slip in a couple of sword strikes here and there while also skillfully defending himself with his shield. The crowd that was looking at this was quite astonished. What was supposed to be a quick little training exercise that should have already ended in Armand's favor was still in full swing. It even looked like the fresh Tier 2 adventurer was winning, as his agility was above this trained pugilist. Did he lie about his level or something? Are we getting scammed? The people that bet against the warrior in red were now worried. This could have been some scam that pitted someone that was above Armand in levels and in experience. That red guy's movements did seem a bit sluggish in the beginning. Was he playing it off? Some of the adventurers noticed that the armored man had started off slow. He even fumbled around a couple of times. Now on the other hand, it looked like he was slowly gaining the upper hand. It was as if he was someone that was just learning to use a new weapon, and only now was he getting the hang of it. Armand doesn't seem to be in on it, at least. One of the adventurers pointed at the tanned man that took on a different fighting position. His darkish skin started changing color into a more reddish tint. This color shift was accompanied by bulging of muscles. While the adventurer was already muscular before this, now he just looked like an overpumped bodybuilder. All kinds of veins could be seen coming off those rippling muscles. It was clear that he activated some kind of pugilist skill. The effect showed as his speed and strength were at a different level than before. A punch connected with the borrowed shield that almost instantly collapsed onto itself. The man in red armor had to abandon it while jumping back. He did it by throwing it at his opponent. The pugilist just smacked it to the side, but it looked like it was just a feint from the armored man's side. His armor changed its hue to green again as he tried to deliver a sword strike to his opponent's back. The hit went through, but the result that he was probably hoping for wasn't there. The flimsy steel sword bent backward after it connected with that muscular body. The adventurers that bet against the man in crimson cheered. It looked like it would be over soon. There was no way for a knight type to win against a martial artist type in hand-to-hand combat. It's over fresh meat. Armand had already forgotten that this was just a test of strength for a new silver rank adventurer candidate. The elven lady started even shouting out to stop the fight, but the man wouldn't listen. He was already charging forward with his fist aiming for his opponent's head. The armored man responded not by evading but by blocking with a cross-arm block. Everyone expected the man to just be sent flying with a broken forearm, but this wouldn't be happening. The armor glowed in a blue hue right before the fist connected with the block. He slid back slightly, but he stood his ground. Armand had overswung a bit, so he was left open for a counterblow. The armor glowed in a red hue now before the punch collided with those rippling side muscles. The crowd shouted out as they saw the hit connect with Armand's liver. It was clear that this hit hurt. Armand was clearly in pain as he stumbled backward. He had some air knocked out of him for sure, and his opponent wouldn't let him regain his footing that easily. For the people here, it was strange to see a slugfest between a martial artist and a man dressed in full-body armor. It didn't look like he was even that good at it, but whenever Armand tried to retaliate, the kicks and punches that he threw and that connected didn't seem to be that effective. Each time a flash of blue would cover that armor and somehow cause those huge fists to not be as effective. Just by attrition, it looked like the newbie was winning. At one juncture the two got in a bout of strength, their fingers interlocking. "I'll break your fingers." Armand's eyes were quite bloodshot from the prolonged fighting, and his muscular body had taken some hits. Normally a pugilist would have the strength advantage, but it didn't look like the other party was budging. The armor turned red again and the adventurers could hear a crunching sound. This appeared to be poor Armand's fingers that were getting pushed in by his opponent. The man gritted his teeth and was quick to deliver a headbutt to the armored man. Both of them jumped back while glaring at each other. Before the fight could continue further, a womanly voice called out from the side. "That's enough, stop." The elven receptionist woman jumped into the ring to stop the test. The crowd that was on the sides out started shouting and booing as the victor was not decided. "Why are you interfering? This isn't over." Armand called out while trying not to flinch. His hands didn't look too good after some of the fingers were broken. He was quick to set them in place though. It didn't look like this was his first rodeo. "Mr. Armand, please calm down, this was only meant to be a test." "You too, Mr. Wayland, please stop." Roland gave out a sigh of relief after the elven lady jumped in to stop the fight. He wasn't sure how long he would be able to keep this up. The man he was facing was well over his level and had higher physical stats to boot. It was all thanks to his armor that he was able to survive this long. He didn't want to stand out too much, so he decided not to use obvious mage spells during this whole bout. Testing out his new gear in the field also caused him to go with another approach. The constant color shifting was an indication of his switching to certain preset programs. This was an idea he came up with after remembering an old game he used to play. The green color would cause a massive boost to agility, the blue color would be the defensive mode, and red would increase his strength. By switching between these modes on the fly, he was able to somewhat overpower this higher level opponent. This was just a runic program that switched between buffing spells and the corresponding mana stones that increased certain stats. Thanks to this, he could either switch between specialized boosts in one stats or spread it out evenly. It took him some time to get used to the agility boost the most, but luckily his opponent wasn't taking him that seriously. This allowed him to field test this armor of his, which he thought was a big success. There was some lag between switching the various modes and he accumulated some damage as well. This was something that he expected, and now he just needed to work out some kinks. "No, I won't accept this." It wasn't his own strength, it was all that armor, you saw it. Roland wanted to go ask if with this he would get his silver rank, but it seemed that his instructor wasn't seeing it his way. It was clear that the man didn't take the draw well. Roland knew that if he started to use some of those common grade attacking spells he had, that his opponent would have probably been down for the count a lot sooner though. He also wasn't able to use his own shield and sword. Those two wouldn't have been trashed that easily. Would you tell that to a monster that used an enchanted sword? What? After getting closer to the elven receptionist and the man that was his instructor, he had to chime in. From Roland's perspective, this armor was a part of his strength, it was something he made and there was no shame in using it. The man was clearly acting immaturely, trying to shift the blame on the use of magical gear. You know what I mean, do you want me to take you on with my bare fists? Roland's point was easy, each class had its strong and weak points. Him using magical gear was clearly acceptable. Though it didn't seem that other people saw it his way, probably because no one knew that he made this armor himself. In their eyes, he looked to be some spoiled rich kid that was using magic equipment to come out on top. He could clearly see some disdained faces from the side, but after his show of might, not many people would speak their mind in front of him. Before another fight could break out, the elven lady was quick to pull Armand away. Roland on the other hand was told to wait in the guild building. Back there he could see the gazes of the other adventurers, this was something that he had hoped to avoid. The only good thing that came out of this was that he was able to test his new armor. In about 15 minutes the elven lady was back out again. He was even handed a healing potion on the house. What she told him afterward only cemented in his mind that people here looked down on individuals that used runic equipment. Due to the test being inconclusive, you will be given a secondary mission. For a moment he wanted to go find Armand and shove an ice arrow up his behind. Luckily the request was something that aligned with his own plans. It was to go to the dungeon and get some tier 2 monster materials. With this in mind, he left the Adventurer Guild. His armor didn't suffer that much damage, so he could finish this up in one day. Chapter 85, Going down to the 10th floor. Haha, did a group of mole rats have their way with you? Screw off. A large burly man with no hair was laughing at Armand, the instructor that just faced off against Roland. The pugilist was in a sorry state, he was holding his hands that were slowly healing after some of his fingers were broken. This wasn't the actual cause of him looking pale though. The skill that he activated took quite a bit out of him. It wasn't something that could be used for a prolonged amount of time, it was mostly there for a short burst of power to finish off an enemy. He didn't win. It was all because of that armor, if he didn't have it on I'd crush him with one hit. The older man walked over closer, he was really tall, not something that a human could achieve. There was a total lack of hair on his head and his body looked like it was carved out from stone. This man was clearly from the Goliath race, which was quite the rarity in this warm climate. This race of smaller giants preferred mountain regions and more secluded areas. Is that so? I wouldn't be so sure about that, it felt like he was holding something back. What? Armand looked quite pissed, his fingers were still numb and the potion would need some time to heal his bones. Things like cuts could be mended faster, but when getting down to the bone the quality of the potion had to increase for it to work faster. Why are you even here? Don't you have a guild to run or something? Can't a kind old man check up on one of his best prospects? One that lost so beautiful, wait till the others hear about it at the pub. Maybe now you can start taking things more seriously. A wooden chair flew towards the large old man. It connected with the wall next to him, which caused him to laugh more before walking out of the room. You shouldn't tease him so much, Guildmaster. He'll be fine, he needs to be taken down a peg. Good that we have some promising young warriors coming in. What do you think? You watched the entire fight, right, Solana? The man that was called the Guildmaster asked the elven receptionist that was responsible for Roland's test. Both of them walked through one of the guild's corridors after Armand had to be brought in for some healing. That youth, how should I put it, normally someone of his level shouldn't be able to use runic armor like that. You noticed it too? Yes sir, the mana that the armor was emitting was staggering. I'm not sure how he did it, but even a high-level tier 2 mage would have problems using that many runes and mana stones at once. The old man rubbed his chin that was covered by a short beard. Must be some special class, those weren't the movements of a scrawny mage. Well, keep an eye on him and report anything unusual. Should I update his card or? The old man turned to the smaller elf and shook his head. No, have him get us some monsters that live below the 10th level. Otherwise, he might also grow a big head like our little Armand. Let's see how he handles unjust setbacks. The elven lady nodded while the two parted ways. The man that was the guild master had quite the grin on his face as he left. She returned to inform Roland of the second mission that he needed to fulfill. Solana couldn't see how well he took that decision, but she could have sworn that she heard a grunt behind that visor. The moment the armored man left, the guild went abuzz. The people that bet on a tie were laughing out crazily as they made quite the coin. Most of them were cursing, though, as not many believed that Armand could lose in any way or that this fight would take this long to finish. Through this, Roland had made some hidden enemies along with increasing his fame. Didn't the receptionist call that person Wayland? Do we have someone like that living in the city? Some people that were interested in the Crimson Armored Man's identity were quick to gather information. It was always good to know who you were dealing with, and this was clearly a strong individual. Please everyone quiet down. The second receptionist, that looked like a businesswoman with glasses, shouted out. The whole fight was causing too much of a commotion and no work was being done. Soon everyone straightened out and everything returned to normal. While this was happening, Roland was walking towards the dungeon. Killing Tier 2 monsters would be quite easy to him at this point. This was something he was able to do even before reaching this class. He couldn't really cheat this quest. Bringing over mana stones was one thing, but monster parts was another. They would know if he did it himself by the creature's freshness. It would probably be better to just bring over the whole body as proof instead of disassembling it. He didn't want them to look for some other loopholes. While walking towards the dungeon, Roland thought back to how the fight went. After working on himself for a year by battling monsters alone, he was slowly developing as a fighter. With the help of his gear, he was now somewhat able to contend with higher tier opponents. Though, if that guy took me seriously from the start, he would have probably won. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that he would have come out on top in a proper fight. Even though he didn't have his shield or sword, the other guy was the same. It was lucky that that martial artist was easy to anger and was constantly on the attack. If he took some time to assess the situation, the outcome could have been different. But I also didn't use any attack spells. One good attack could have decided the battle. This was also why he wasn't willing to demonstrate his full capabilities during the test. Anyone that would try to battle him now would expect the sudden speed and strength boosts. They wouldn't expect a flamethrower coming from his hand, though. He had managed to squeeze in a few attacking spells here and there, but also onto his shield or sword to not strain his armor too much. I should probably increase my pace. He looked at the road ahead. There weren't many people around, as most of the adventurers would be already at the dungeon. There wasn't a set time for people to be there, but most went there in the morning and came back before sundown. It was similar to a full-time job, but you had the flexibility of taking a break whenever you pleased. Roland left his larger spatial bag that could actually hold his bike in it back at home. Though he would probably look strange riding it around with his armor on, so it was fine to just walk there this time around. With a small jolt of his energy, the Crimson Armor's runes started flashing in green. His agility stat was boosted instantly and he felt light on his feet. So he ran. His speed was higher than a pro sprinter from his old world would be capable of, and this was only a steady jog towards his destination. It was a strange sight to see a man at about 190 centimeters of height in a full set of armor just running. His strides were large and it looked like instead of sprinting he was jumping small distances forward. This was the type of enchantment that lowered the user's mana by a set number without burning through it. Thanks to this, he would only need to keep watch over his stamina. The way he constructed this armor allowed him to switch between these buffing spells. Thanks to this, his mana wouldn't go below a certain point. These buffing spells only activated the corresponding mana stones that increased his stats while taking a small number of magic points to activate. Most of the time he had it running where all the stats were equally distributed. With an emphasis on physical stats, as his willpower and intelligence were already high enough. He put on the brakes before arriving at the usual dungeon entrance. People gave him some glances here and there due to the new armor. There was some danger in wearing such costly-looking gear, mostly from the thief guild types. This establishment was slowly creeping into this new city along with others as it expanded. He wasn't hit hard yet, only some small-time burglary attempts by lower-level thieves. It was unknown to him if they would ever try to rob him blind. There was that one time in Edelgard, so he was prepared. He didn't feel like he would lose to normal thieves now even without traps. While on the inside he pulled out his shield and sword. The enchantment was switched to a more all-around stat boost. After spending close to a month playing around in this forge and procuring new materials, he felt like going wild. His first opponent was a little flaming skeleton that went down with one quick slice of the sword. There wasn't really anything left for him to do on these upper levels. Nothing up here could survive even one slice from his sword. Roland even decided to check out his favorite grinding spot with the troglodytes. He wouldn't be tossing any magical grenades or wide area spells into their tiny room. Instead, he used the old-fashioned way by walking into the large wide open room where they would descend. This time around there were no other adventurers here, so he had free rein. The passages slammed shut and the ugly lizard monsters started crawling out. This reminded him about the trial area where the monsters came at him in the arena. These lizardman-looking monsters were a lot weaker at most at the levels of the imps that he faced during his class change. They charged at him with their claws and teeth but found themselves unable to hit their target. Each time a clawed hand descended to slice him apart, he stepped out of the way. What followed after was a quick slice through the neck which decapitated the creature in one quick move. His sword was also made from deep steel and shining in a blue light. The sword that he used also had some advanced runes on it. The default was the strengthening rune along with a sharpness rune. One would help him cleave through his enemies while the other would allow a minimum amount of damage to occur. From what he could tell, the strengthening rune worked in increasing the blade's density and structural integrity while the spell was activated. Roland went with this as he didn't think that an elemental spell of any kind would be that worthwhile. Even if these creatures were mostly fire-based, it didn't mean that they wouldn't be also resistant to other magical elements. Putting a non-elemental enchantment on it was more than enough. He ran out of materials for now, but he was also planning to create a multifunctional spell staff later on. In the future, he might put everything into his armor, but external casting weapons still had their uses. They also would lower the deterioration factor of his armor if he saved up the charges for tougher enemies. Was that the last one? After looking around, he could only see dead lizards without heads. It took him almost no time to take care of them even in an open field battle. He was clearly far stronger than he was before, but it would be unwise of him if this fact made him arrogant. It was a common thing amongst adventurers and people in this world. The boost from a Tier 1 to Tier 2 class was quite large. Some people allowed something like this to cloud their judgment, thinking that they could take on monsters far stronger than they were actually capable of. This was also why Roland was slowly measuring his strength against enemies that he previously faced off. Should I try fighting the boss alone? While going through the monsters' remains and removing their mana stones, he started thinking. On the 10th level, there was the chamber with the boss inside. The monster would respawn after getting killed after 2 days. After being defeated, anyone could venture through the room it was in and go into the next dungeon area. The monster that appeared was also random. Most of the time it was a Tier 2 evolved form of one of the many monsters that could be found in the upper levels. Sometimes it would be some kind of rare variant that could prove deadly for anyone that wasn't prepared. Due to this, it was always risky to venture in alone. The door would close behind anyone venturing inside. The only way out would be to defeat the monster inside. Running away was not an option. Though there was no way out, it didn't mean that it was a hard foe to battle. Everyone already knew what to expect inside, so it was rare for any casualties to occur. Though there was always a risk of a rare variant appearing. Some monsters were harder to kill than others while still being at the same level. His target wasn't really the boss monster this time around, as he needed to get to the area below the 10th level. The boss of that level was also considered stronger than a regular Tier 2 monster, so it would be better to just evade it for now. He descended further below from the 7th level. The monster bodies without the mana stones were left alone as he continued. Enemies that were further down didn't pose a threat to him at this point. Before ranking up to his new class, He had already ventured all the way to the boss chambers, so he knew the way. The boss room is around the corner, someone should have cleared it out by now. Roland was walking down the stairs from the 9th level now, the area below it was a lot smaller than the maze above. There weren't that many monsters on it and the boss room was its focal point. When he arrived he noticed the lack of these close to level 50 enemies. It was clear that some kind of party had just gone through here. There were even some monster remains and blood splatter on the walls. The monster that was guarding this level was something worthwhile to farm. It was actually quite hard to be able to take it on by yourself before other adventurer parties got to it. Sometimes people would camp out in front of the room in hopes of getting the kill. With this fights between adventurers broke out, even resulting in deaths from time to time. This was the reality of this work, it was a rat race for resources. The boss monster would drop a better mana stone than a regular tier 2 beast. There would also be a small treasure chest with free items that appeared as a bonus. This was what people were mostly aiming for, as sometimes deep steel or deep iron weapons with enchantments appeared. Closed. He arrived at the large gate that was the entrance to the boss chambers. This brought a bit of a smile to Roland's face, as for some reason every big monster was apparently locked away behind some kind of large gate. Must have gone in recently, the monster remains here are still fresh. There were a few large monster bodies cut up in the corner. There was a set of monsters that always guarded this room even when the boss didn't respawn yet. Without having anything to do he decided to sit down on a nearby rock. He needed to wait till the people inside were done with their run, only then would he be free to venture past this chamber. So he waited, but something was off. 10 minutes passed, then another 10. This wasn't an amount of time that would be required to clear out that room. What is taking them so long? Was it really some kind of rare variant? He moved closer to the closed gate and tried to listen in, but there was no sound coming through. When he tried to pull on the large chain that was attached to the gate, it didn't budge even with his increased strength. If it's taking them this long, they might die. This wasn't normal. A battle with a monster in there shouldn't take more than 10 to 20 minutes. The chamber wasn't that large and there wasn't really any place to run away, so there was something off about this. While thinking, he activated his improved sight along with his debugging skill. While going around the side he noticed something. There was some kind of enchantment on the side. Could be a way inside, a trap, or a shortcut to the levels below. He didn't consider himself much of a hero, but he wouldn't just let people die in front of him if he could do something about it. Though he also needed to consider his safety first, it might have not been that wise to go inside. After a moment of contemplation, he remembered the time where his old party members saved him from certain doom. If it weren't for them risking their lives, he would probably not be there. I think I watched too many superhero movies. There might be something good inside though. Roland gave out a sigh before going over the runic component on the wall. With some time he got through it and a small human-sized opening appeared. There was a narrow tunnel leading inside and it looked like it was going towards the boss chamber. He placed his kite shield in front of his body and moved forward into the unknown. This wasn't the first secret room that he ventured into, so this wasn't his first rodeo. Chapter 86 Golem. Roland looked back to the door that shut behind him. His eyes glowed in a purple light as he scanned the surroundings. There didn't seem to be any runes on this side of the passage. It looked like there was no way of going back. He grimaced under his helmet before turning around and moving forward. The shield that Roland made had a boss in the center that was protruding slightly. A boss or a umbo was a round, convex or conical piece of material at the center of a shield. This shield had all of the mana stones on the inside as to not let them be crushed during combat. The shield was held out toward the empty corridor while he looked around. Thanks to his skills he was able to detect magical traps, but that didn't help against the normal ones. Roland moved forward slowly. He had no idea of knowing if he would even come out in the boss's chamber or if it was the way to an entirely new location. It could be a hidden treasure trove or another secret passage to a lower or an upper level. There was also the possibility of this passageway being swarmed with monsters. He was slightly regretting his decision, but there was also the adventurer part in him that told him to move forward. This was a new part of him that had been slowly awakening through the constant monster battles. Now he was even starting to enjoy this adrenaline rush. This wasn't the first time that he ventured into a secret chamber either, so this wasn't all that new. Most of the time there wasn't really anything dangerous in these rooms. The most important point was to go in slowly and assess the situation with a clear mind. After treading forward some more he came up to a wall. This one was also locked behind a runic lock. At first, he was surprised that other adventurers weren't able to discover these hidden chambers. But the only reason he was able to do this is due to his debugging skill and rune affinity. A regular mage wouldn't be able to do anything, and other runesmiths didn't really venture down into dungeons. That should do it. With some fiddling, the passage was opened and the wall started to shift. A big slab of rock started sliding up to reveal some light. When he looked inside he discovered a larger chamber. The first thing that he could feel was the increase in temperature. The boss chamber was surrounded by lava from all sides. This was something that he already knew as he had bought up all the information from the guild that he could. When someone entered this room they would be greeted by a narrow bridge going toward a large platform in the middle. The adventurers needed to move to this platform and then the bridge behind them would shift back into the lava. Only then would the boss of this place appear. After the monster was dead another bridge going forward would show itself. The path to go back would also open up and now other people could travel through this room. Where Roland came out, he found himself above this chamber. He was walking forward but with the lack of light, it was a bit confusing. He didn't notice that he was going upwards slightly and now the boss room was almost right below him. Damn, are they all dead? He could see some dead bodies, crushed into paste, and some caved-in heads. There was quite the large monster moving slowly in the middle of it. He recognized the type that it was instantly, and this would be quite the troublesome foe. After glancing at it with his analyze skill he had some more information. It was a rare variant of a golem that appeared in the lower levels. Normally it would be a golem made from stone and magma called the volcanic golem. That one was already hard to kill due to being made from molten rock. Sharp-bladed weapons were almost useless against heavy monsters like this. A massive amount of strength and energy would be required from a person to slice through something like this with a blade. The easier tactic would be to apply heavy hammers or maces to crack the rock bit by bit. Fuck, Roland said while looking at his brand new deep steel sword. Even though it had some protective enchantments it didn't really possess the weight to do much damage to this thing. This ruby golem wasn't fully made from rubies, it was similar to a volcanic golem that was made from hard volcanic rock. There was even fire and magma coming out from some cracks in that rocky hide along from its small head that was similar to a human skull. Besides that there were rubies plastered all over its body. These rubies formed spikes. Those spikes were on its tree trunk-sized arms and legs. They were used to puncture through its opponents in various ways. Before moving forward Roland decided to abandon his blade. What he would use for now was his old mace that went through some refurbishing. It wasn't really on the level of his blade but it would have to do for now. The rune that increased its weight during a fight was something that he needed for this bout. He could see that not everyone was dead yet. The monster was also somewhat damaged as it didn't just decimate the adventurer party. What the monster was moving towards was a person that was wearing a large backpack. He looked familiar but also didn't look like he was an actual adventurer. It was probably someone hired to carry the monster remains and distribute healing potions during the battles. No good, he is going to die. The ruby golem was in the middle of rising up one of its giant arms. Where the hand was supposed to be was a spike made from ruby crystals. It was clearly winding up to deliver a killing blow against its defenseless enemy. If he didn't act the person down there would surely be dead. To save up on some runic charges he went towards one of his backup items. Thanks to maxing out his basic rune condensation skill and now it even leveling up further, he was finally able to scribe card-sized runes. Roland had some side pouches strapped to his belt for that reason. After pulling out one he held it between his thumb and index finger. The card-sized scroll glowed in blue light before changing colors to brown. An arrow made of densely packed rock shot out almost instantly. It whizzed through the air and collided with that raised ruby hand. The collision caused a small explosion to occur while also causing some of the rubies to shatter. This was enough for the monster to turn its hulking body around. At this moment Roland was still standing above the boss stage. He wouldn't just give away his high ground advantage. There were multiple attack scrolls that he possessed, so he decided to use this safe spot to pelt the ruby golem with his spells. The ruby parts that the golem was composed of started cracking slightly, but they were quite hard to damage. Rubies were one of the hardest gemstones, not being much below diamonds on the hardness scale. There were harder minerals in this world, but that didn't make this any easier. For a moment Roland thought that he would be able to just take care of this boss from afar. He had the advantage of being above the monster's reach, but this didn't last for long. After a moment he heard a strange sound behind him. He quickly turned around to see a darkish red glow. Hot magma started flooding into this small corridor of his. The only way out was jumping down to the platform below. There was also quite a large chunk of spiked rubies flying his way from the other side. Somehow the golem had thrown its entire fist that was composed of rubies at him. The collision caused a resounding boom to flow through the room. The whole place shook around while Roland landed on his own 2 feet. He had made quite the landing as spider web-like cracks formed in the spot that he descended into. Now he was able to see the monster from closer up. It was quite big, at least 5 meters tall and wide as a small house. It was missing its right hand, but somehow the creature was regenerating itself. He could see the rubies manifesting themselves and slowly growing to form new sharp spikes. Before the monster could get near him, he activated more of his attacking scroll spells. Various colorful magical arrows and bolts collided with the giant monster that was pushed back slightly. After the smoke had cleared, he could see some cracks and fissures here and there, but it didn't look like it would be going down this easily. The golems always have a core inside their body. I need to destroy it. Golems were one of the toughest monsters to go against. Their bodies were resistant to both physical and magical attacks. They had one weakness though. They were similar to slimes in that regard, as they also possessed a monster core. If destroyed or even shifted from its original spot, the monster would cease its functions. Most of these golems had partially exposed cores, which allowed for a somewhat bearable fight. The fight mostly consisted of slowly aiming for the exposed core till it gave out. This golem was a bit different due to being a rare variant, and Roland had an idea why. The core must be behind that mass of rubies. He could see that this thing posed quite the amount of red crystals on its back. These were quite concentrated, which implied that the important part was back there. The biggest problem there would be smashing his way in. With his mace in his hand and shield in the other, he moved forward. His armor glowed in a green light as he activated his agility-focused mana stone structure. With the increased speed, he was able to easily evade the attack that this lumbering giant executed. While the golems were very resistant to most forms of attack, they had one critical weakness: their speed. They were like slow tanks that could barely react to their enemies. This was also why the wide swings were quite easy to evade. The green glow shifted to red in a moment as the mace descended to one of the monster's knee joints. With the increased strength and the impact rune, a devastating blow was delivered. He was even surprised at the amount of damage he was able to deliver. He didn't come off scot-free, as just as the attack caused the knee to crumble, his hand was in a world of hurt. Clearly, the increase of strength, speed, and force wasn't something his body was used to. This, combined with hitting a hard resistant target, caused his hand to almost break. He had no quick heal spells of any kind, so there was no way of healing his arm if it broke. Potions wouldn't work fast enough to be used during battle, so this caused him to back away. He was left with a numb hand with which he had trouble clutching his mace, and his hand began to shake. The only good thing about this situation was that the golem's leg had given out and the monster dropped to the ground. It was still there though, and somehow the ruby crystals were pushing themselves into the shattered rock pieces. It looked that if he didn't use this moment to his advantage, the monster would heal itself. The biggest problem here was the weapon he was using. The amount of force was too much for a one-handed mace. The proper weapon that would give him an advantage would require two hands to disperse the shock. Hey, you can use this. Before he could think about another strategy, he heard a voice from the side. It was the person with the large backpack calling out to him. He wanted to ask what that person wanted, but he soon realized the reason. In this young man's hands, he could spot a large war hammer that looked more like a sledgehammer. It was just the weapon type that he needed to take care of a slow-moving monster like this. Roland wasn't sure how, but the young man had somehow managed to circle around him while carrying this hammer himself. It looked like he could barely lift it, but he was somehow managing. The golem was still on the ground and waiting for its leg to heal, so there wasn't much time to think. He looked at his mace that was also slightly damaged after he delivered a full swing. The man was now close, so he decided to take him up on the offer. The mana stones embedded in his armor started glowing in red and he grasped the new weapon with one hand. Roland could see a look of surprise on the young man's face. He was able to lift this heavy weapon with just one hand thanks to his now increased stats. He quickly turned around and moved closer to the golem. The monster was in the process of standing up after patching up its knee joint. Before that could happen though, a heavy object collided with it once more. The heavy hammer that he was using had a simple strengthening enchantment on it that wouldn't last long. It was heavy enough for the blow to cause a similar amount of damage that his previous mace strike did. Thanks to this now being a larger two-handed weapon, the force wasn't as concentrated on his one hand. He still felt some of the impact rattling his bones, but it was far more bearable than before. With the second hit, the rubies that were holding it together started to crack and shatter. Roland had to quickly jump back as the monster swung one of its huge arms at him. It was quite a slow reaction, so he had ample amounts of time to activate his speed boost and to circle to the creature's back. This time around, with another wind-up, he delivered a smack to its posterior. The large ruby crystals that were protruding out of there started to break. He kept circling around the monster's back while hitting it. With the broken leg, the monster could only somewhat crawl around. Soon something round that was of a different coloring became exposed. This was the creature's core. With one more smack, he could feel his hands going numb once more. The hammer that he was holding was also starting to get bent out of shape. He had to grit his teeth while delivering the blows. If he let this thing time to recover, it would be over. Then finally, with one last hard smack, the monster's golem core started cracking. Before he could cheer at his hard-fought victory, he heard the youth's voice from the back again. Wait, if you damage the core like that, the golem is going to blow. Roland glanced at the damaged core and the golem. Thanks to his mana sense, he could see a small rise in the magical concentration in the air. He quickly threw the hammer to the side and sprinted back to the man that he rescued. His shield was placed on the ground during the time he was picking up the hammer. Now it was in these youth's hands and he needed it back. Give me that and take cover behind me. He grasped his shield with one hand and crouched down. While he activated the protective magic, he had the other person curl up behind him to save up on space. With no other structures around them, he would need to defend them both with his shield. Soon the monster started showing cracks that were pulsating with fiery energy. In no time the whole golem burst up in flames along with an explosion. Sharp rocks and gemstones started flying everywhere while causing widespread destruction. Roland's shield could produce various mana barriers. He had inscribed it similar to his armor, where he could select between the correct elemental shield for each occasion. This time he would go with a fire rock shield combo, just right to protect him from this hail of molten rock. Even with the magic at full swing, he could feel the explosion pushing him back slightly. This was followed by a large number of rocks of various sizes hitting his shield. This barrage continued for a moment until the whole boss chamber looked like a war zone. That should be it. The light from the runes on his shield started to dim as he stood up. What was left from the monster was a large pile of rocks. Most of its remains had exploded and flew into the river of magma below. This meant that there wouldn't be many rubies that he would be able to salvage from this. These monster gemstones weren't that costly as well compared to the natural gemstone. The battle was over and he was victorious. The party of adventurers that had arrived here in hopes of riches was now no more. The only survivor was the youth that was used to carry around the adventurers' luggage. After glancing at him again, he recalled bumping into this person back in the store and then again while walking into the city today. The party had probably gone here while he was performing the guild advancement test. They were truly unlucky to run into a 1 in 1,000 rare variant of a golem. Should I go to the guild and report this? He thought to himself while looking at the blast zone that left everything destroyed. He glanced at the scared youth that was coughing from all the volcanic dust. The area started rumbling and the bridges connecting to the exits started to appear as they signaled the defeat of the boss monster. Chapter 87 Great Reward? Bernier dropped down onto his butt after seeing the monster finally go down. The bloody battle was finally over and the monster had self-detonated after getting its core cracked by the man wearing the crimson armor. He thought back to how this day started. Bernier had just recently joined up with a fresh adventurer party. Not as a part of it, more as a freelancer that was doing odd jobs for them for money. There was a reason why he was here all alone and without his family. This young man was close to 170 centimeters in height with red hair. He had a scruffy beard that was in the same color along with large brown eyes. His stature was a bit wide and his hands had some meat on them. He was wearing a cheap set of leather armor but most of it was just dark cloth. Being a half-dwarf half-human made his upbringing quite hard. The particular village that he grew up in didn't take too kindly to his father marrying a human woman. Then calamity struck, the village was attacked by monsters, and he and many others were left with no parents. The people that were against him living as a half-breed there took this chance to slowly shun him. In time it was too much and he decided to try hitting it off on his own. The news of the new dungeon city getting built caused him to dream of a new beginning. There was no work in the village he was in, none of the dwarven blacksmiths or artisans were willing to hire him, so it was time to leave. It took some time to get here, the journey wasn't easy as he didn't have much money. He had to perform tasks for the caravan that he joined and sometimes sleep outside with nothing but the night sky above him. After about a month the new city was on the horizon and the dream of an easy life was close to being grasped. At least that was his initial thought, but reality tended to be different than a person imagined. He wasn't greeted with warmth but with spite as well. The smithies that he applied for didn't take him very seriously. At most, they would let him carry the materials around but never let him continue his craft of blacksmithing. He was left with only a promise that if he did his time they might allow him to work on some horseshoes in the future. Thus his money problems started, he was forced to perform odd jobs again. He wasn't strong in any meaning of the term, so the only thing worth the time was helping the adventurers carry their items. This line of work wasn't what he had in mind when he came here and it barely paid the bills. He was left with a minuscule amount of what the adventurers sold at the guild. His tasks were to pick apart the monster corpses and carry all the equipment that the adventurers couldn't be bothered with. Bernier had seen Roland wandering town from time to time. He always had peculiar unmatching armor on which made him stand out. This half-dwarf was someone that was aching to work with his hammer. The only thing he could do was watching other craftsmen create. Then came this fateful day, the armor that Roland was wearing today was different than usual. The craftsmanship had improved and the application of runes made Bernier's mouth water as he bumped into him when they were leaving for the dungeon. The party he was a part of consisted mostly of steel-ranked adventurers with the leader being a fresh silver rank. There were 6 of them and he was the 7th member. Bernier wasn't really considered as part of the group, he was always getting ordered around left and right. Left with only scraps at the end of the day after having his hands bloody. Besides the leader, all the others were in their high 40s in levels. After the leader finally advanced it was decided to wander below the 10th level. Bernier felt that it was too soon with only 1 silver rank adventurer around, but he didn't have a say in this. They told him to shut up and just hide in the back as always. From his perspective things were actually looking good, the team was beating all the monsters quite easily. Even when they got to the 10th level the guards in front of the boss monster's chamber weren't all that tough to beat. So finally the party ventured forth to battle the maze boss. They weren't even planning to do this, to begin with. The original plan was to go fight some tier 2 monsters at the starting point a bit past the boss monster chamber. Instead, they found the passage closed and with a fresh tier 2 monster waiting for them on the inside. They all knew that this was risky but also that it could be very lucrative. Everyone knew that after defeating this monster there would be some kind of prize waiting at the end. This 10th level monster was hard to fight as a lot of adventurers were willing to set up camp before the entrance and farm for items. For some reason, it was open this day. Greed got the better of Bernier's party and the rest was history. Roland arrived not long after to save his life. While his party members were trying to fight the golem, he was shivering in the back while trying to distribute potions. The monster was slow but its stamina was unending. One hit was enough to devastate anyone from this party. The party of adventurers gave it all, but after their shield warrior was pounded to meat paste it was over. The rest started falling like flies, going down mostly in one hit. This boss clearly out-leveled their leader, which was that shield warrior that fell first. Bernier's chest was still pounding even though it was over. The rocky bridges that connected this room to the exit were now slowly rising back up. He had looked around if anyone survived even before the explosion, but everyone was dead. He was the only survivor and was lucky enough to have gotten away with it with only some minor bruising. At this moment he was looking at the man dressed in crimson armor that had saved him. This warrior was walking over to the spot that the ruby golem detonated. There wasn't really anything left besides some broken off gems. I might have to go back to the guild and report this. Bernier heard the man mumble to himself while kicking around the golem parts. Soon he turned around to face him, which caused the half-dwarf to stand at attention. He didn't think that the man was hostile after he had already saved him, but there was always a small possibility that he could end up dead. It was possible for this armored man to see him as an eyesore. Some people would get rid of all witnesses and then rob the adventurer corpses of all their belongings. Though in this situation there wasn't much left of them. The large detonation pushed almost everything into the lava below the boss chamber's platform. The only thing that was worth something was Bernier's backpack that he still had with him. It was a spatial item that was worth a lot, but it wasn't his. It was an item that was given to him by the adventurer party, but they were all gone now, so it would belong to him as the only one that survived. That is, if this armored warrior didn't see a problem with that. Hey, you! Why yes! He snapped back to reality after the man in the red armor called out to him. After poking around through the monster's remains and gathering some of the materials, he finally focused his attention on Bernier. Can you walk? Ah, why yes! Bernier quickly jumped up to his feet to show off that he was fine. Good, we'll have to make a report to the guild, so you'll have to come along with me. The golem's core wasn't totally destroyed, it should be enough as proof. The other person in the armor started talking. It looked like he didn't have any ulterior motives and wanted him to report to the guild about this situation. Bernier let out a sigh of relief as it looked like he would be getting out of this in the end. Also sorry for your loss. The man was about to turn around but then slowly faced him again. Bernier just nodded while scratching his head. Thank you, we weren't really that close though. He replied while the man turned around to look at the monster's remains. He picked up some of the crumbled rubies and started looking over them. Before he pocketed them, Bernier opened up his mouth. You shouldn't take that, without the golem's core those gems will turn into regular rocks soon. He was in this business for some time now and had done some research. He knew that golem remains were slightly different. They might have looked like resources ready for plucking, but that wasn't entirely true. It will. Why yes, golems with a large core like that need mana for some of their body parts to function. If it was a regular iron golem, then the ores it was made from could be reused. What about these volcanic rocks then? They could be refined into special fire-resistant metal, not as good as deep iron but better than regular iron. The man in the crimson armor looked at the ruby that he was holding and tossed it to the side. He then picked up one of the larger rocks that was previously a part of the golem and started to examine it. After a moment it looked like he came to some conclusion as he started pushing the rock into one of his spatial bags. Bernier looked at this and could see that the bag that he had was a bit small. I could help you with that. His gratitude to the man that saved him was big. he wasn't really very invested in his old adventurer party. They never treated him like one of their own, so finding a new job would be paramount. He was now looking at a powerful adventurer that was able to defeat a golem all alone. Maybe if he played his cards right he could come up big after this loss. The man in the red armor turned around to look at Bernier again. He started looking through the entire room. There were pieces of this golem everywhere. Even though a lot of it was tossed in the lava, some raw materials still remained. If you want, go ahead. Bernier smiled before moving towards the monster's remains. He knew that maybe if he did a good job he could be hired by someone like this. This man was clearly someone that didn't speak often, but he was already treating him better than his old co-workers. Those guys would shout at him constantly and even sometimes force him to be monster bait. Though he wasn't so sure about this man, but it didn't seem that he had an ulterior motive. Thank you, sir. I'll be sure to do a good job. The half-dwarf replied while moving his butt in gear. In his mind, it could be possible to land himself in a better position than when he entered this dungeon. The man before him looked to be a silver rank adventurer, maybe even a gold one. If he could become his helper, then he might actually start earning some real money. Sir? You don't need to call me that. Then how should I refer to you, sir? Just call me Wayland. Bernier tried to recall where he heard that name and connected it to some rumors in town. There was supposedly some eccentric living out of the city in a farmhouse. This someone apparently didn't really like to interact with other people. Will do, Mr. Wayland, you can call me Bernier. There were even rumors that people went missing around his house from time to time. Though he didn't really believe those, as he was mostly interested in the fact that this Wayland person was supposed to be some kind of smith. This only caused him to go into high gear, as he was very much interested in getting to work at a proper forge. While Bernier was thinking about what the future had in store for him, Roland was walking through the cleared-out boss chamber. The bridges that were slowly rising were almost up, so he would be able to leave in a moment. There was one last thing for him to do here. He knew that after this boss fight there should have been some kind of reward waiting for him. From what he had heard, there should be a chest with an item in it. How rare and valuable the treasure would be depended on how strong the boss was. The whole place rumbled as the bridges were finally connecting to the platform. He could even see magma dripping down from them. It would probably be better to wait a few minutes before going through them. Luckily he was smart enough to get boots that were made from fire-resistant leather as well. Then it finally happened, a small compartment opened up right in the middle of this battle stage. It looked very game-like, as the item that was there was a bronze chest. There only needed to be some catchy tune and it would look like something straight out of a game. The golem was a rare monster variant, the rewards should reflect this. Roland walked over to the middle of this chamber and waited for the chest to show up. Before opening it up, he examined everything around it with the help of his skills. Analyzing and scanning it with his runic eyes didn't show him much. Bronze chest intermediate. There were no enchantments that he could see, and he couldn't really feel any mana fluctuations either. Roland wasn't sure about just opening it, as there could be traps. There was also the possibility of this being a mimic, which was a monster that took on the form of chests. The probability was low, but being the cautious type, he gave it a few pokes with his sword. Want me to open it? Bernier called out to him from the side. Roland could see the young man's surprised expression, as if he was doing something silly. It looked like the half-dwarf didn't see any danger in opening this chest. There was also no lock on it, a person just needed to lift it up to see the prize inside. It's fine, I'll do it myself. He replied while still being a bit apprehensive. He used the tip of his sword to wedge it inside before flipping the chest open. Even though it looked like it would be fine, he still protected himself with his shield from any possible explosions or poisonous arrows shooting out of there. Hey! The chest was opened and there was no trap inside. There was also no weapon or armor piece in there either. Is that? Roland reached into the bronze chest and pulled out the item that was inside. Bernier, that was picking up the remains from the ruby golem, looked in with interest as well. He also was wondering what the prize for a strong boss monster like this would be. Is that a monster egg? Bernier called out from the side. Roland was holding a large egg. It was far larger than a regular chicken egg, close to what an ostrich egg would be. It was a darker shade of red with some black stripes that weren't uniform in length or width. Monster egg? Roland's analyzing skill wasn't high enough to give him any specifics on this thing. It was clearly an egg from some kind of monster. If it was rare and would fetch him a good price on the market was unknown. He knew that there were tamer and summoner classes that could do things with eggs like this, but he wasn't sure if he would have a use for it. He looked to Bernier with the egg in hand. He knew that there was a living creature in this item, so placing it in a spatial bag wouldn't really work. The half-dwarf picked up on his intention and was quick to walk over. Here, hold on to it for now. The bridges that were raised were now cool enough to go through, and the large doors that were previously locked were now opening. It was time to report to the guild. He could resume his silver adventurer quest later. The man that he saved was now his responsibility, and he would see to it that he returned safely above ground. Chapter 88 Unwanted Sleepover. Roland's journey back up was mostly uneventful. The monsters at the lower levels were far too weak, and his new partner was actually being helpful. Any monster that he slew, the young man was able to disassemble quite fast. He was also good at pointing out which monster parts would sell for the most coins. There was only one downside to this, as it took him more time to return, which left Roland prompting him to hurry it up. When the two survivors were out, it was already late at night. The Adventurers Guild wasn't something that was open 24/7, mostly closing at about 10 p.m. It seemed that he would have to return tomorrow to make his report. The biggest problem was this half-dwarf that was following him around. He had a strange submissive look on his face whenever Roland looked his way. Whenever he praised him for giving him some valuable market information or about the monster parts, he seemed ecstatic. It was as if the man had never been validated in his life before. But now they were out of the dungeon, he could just meet up with the guy on the next day. There wasn't really a need to have the half-dwarf testify with him. He was mostly doing it for peace of mind. The adventurers that died could have families. They might have wished to know what happened to their dead relatives. Roland was unfamiliar with them, so the explanation would be left up to the half-dwarf. There was also the info about the rare golem that could be actually sold for money, which he was aiming for. This and him slaying it could help him get through the silver rank quest if his new friend confirmed his story. Bernie, was it? I guess I'll see you at the Adventurers Guild tomorrow. It's Bernier, but sure thing, sir. Wayland. Stop calling me sir, I'm not a knight. Roland continued walking as they passed the dungeon guards. They wouldn't really care about the report, as that wasn't their part of the job. They were only there to keep untrained people with no adventurer cards from wandering into the dungeon below. His house was between the dungeon and the city of Albrook. It took him about 30 minutes on foot to get there from this spot, then another half an hour to get to town. The walk directly from the city took about 40 minutes, his house wasn't directly between the two landmarks. So it was time to head back. The path towards his home split off from the main road, which made his bike a bit hard to use. This time around he didn't have it with him, it needed a larger spatial bag that was more of a backpack for him to be able to remove it. He had gone down into the dungeon thinking that he would only need to defeat a couple of tier 2 monsters. Without his bike, he would need to make the walk back home the old-fashioned way. Roland was able to test his new armor extensively, and it worked a lot better than he expected. There was a bit of a lag between the runic spell's activations, which he would need to work on. Other than that, his mana stone armor was working just fine. He didn't get to test out some of the inbuilt attacking spells as he was trying to save up on charges. If I can lower the size of these wands further, maybe if I attach them to my gauntlet or vambrace, I could use them as disposable magic tools. This was one of the ideas that he thought up while fighting with this armor. He remembered when he was blasting the monster from afar while using his small scrolls. His rune shrinking skill was now leveling up further. If he managed to minimize the design even further, he could start adding small rods or plates with disposable runic structures. Maybe even add a holster for disposable runic scrolls for one-time use. He wanted to design them in such a way that during a prolonged fight he could just pop a used-up plate out and insert a new one. There wouldn't even be a need to make these ammunition-type spells from better metals, he could use plain steels that would hold a couple of charges. This would be good for my armor's longevity and would cut the costs significantly. Roland was walking towards his house while Bernier was behind him. The half-dwarf liked to talk, but it seemed that he had given up on it after Roland started thinking about improving his gear design. In reality, this wasn't why Bernier was being quiet. He started to slowly fall behind while walking. At first, he thought that the half-dwarf was just going his own way, but then he heard a thud sound behind him. After turning around to see what the noise was about, he could then see Bernier face planted on the ground with the large backpack covering most of his body. "Hey, Bernie, are you okay?" he called out, but after a moment of silence, it was clear that his new acquaintance was far from it. Roland moved over with haste and flopped the young man onto his back. His eyes shone with some light as he used his identification skill on him. This was the fastest way to see if something was wrong. With the new levels in this skill and after it advanced to the higher tier, he was now able to see people's MP and SP numbers. It was clear after one glance, that Bernier had no stamina points left. He had remained silent and never asked him to take a break during the whole journey back from the dungeon. Was he just being stubborn? Why did this guy not tell him that he was close to passing out was unclear. He might have been afraid that he would be left alone to fend for himself, or he was just trying to be tough. The reason wasn't really important. Now Roland had another problem on his hands. I can't just leave him here, some stray monsters could get to him. I don't have any stamina potions either. Bernier passed out after they walked for 15 minutes from the dungeon location. They were still close to the main road leading to the city, but it was very late. Other adventurers might run into the sleeping half-dwarf, but that didn't mean that they would help him. There were also monsters living out in these lands. The forests were dense in these parts, so some of them hid there. He even ran into some low-level creatures from time to time, but they mostly fled from people above their level like him. They would certainly not flee from a juicy passed-out half-dwarf though. Do I need to carry him back to the city? Roland had the strength to carry this guy around and the backpack with no problem, but going to the city like that would take some time. His own house, on the other hand, was 15 minutes away from this spot. The more logical thing to do would be to take him along to his home and let him stay there for the night. But then Roland's trust issues sprung into action once more, which made him question that option. Well, I could dump him into my shed. Don't think he will steal any of those old tools from it. After going through some options, he decided to take him along towards his own house. He didn't need to allow him to sleep in it directly, as his shed was a good option. Thanks to this being a volcanic area, the weather was warm. He wouldn't freeze even when sleeping in a tool shed. The same shed that he used as a dummy workshop. With a small nod, he decided on taking the half-dwarf with him. Normally he would sling him over his shoulder, but there was still the backpack that would be in the way. He wound up putting it on his back while carrying Bernier in his hands in the front. The monster egg was in one of the side pockets of this large backpack. Roland was sure to check if it didn't shatter during the fall, and it was just fine. I picked up quite the ugly princess. Roland groaned inwardly while walking forward. The young man that he was carrying wasn't the prettiest and also needed a bath after what happened in that dungeon. Though he wasn't sure if this was just Bernier natural fragrance. He was in the minority of the common people that washed themselves every day. Not everyone could fashion themselves a runic bathtub with clear magical water. Finally, after about 15 minutes, he was back home. There were no street lights, but he had a night vision rune inscribed in his helmet to help him out with that. After entering through the main gate, he flopped Bernier down on the ground. Roland moved into his house first to get some things. He had an old straw mattress that he didn't use at all, as later he fashioned a large bed for himself with a softer finish. He fetched a blanket that he carried with the straw bed to his log shed. I think I'll just burn it after this guy is gone. He placed the small half-dwarf onto the makeshift bedding and placed the blanket over him. He didn't have any spare pillows to give and didn't want to have that unkempt red mop on any of his good pillows either. The shed that he was using as a backup plan for thieves looked a bit dusty and unkempt. He didn't really like to clean it and only worked there to make some basic things like nails or hinges for doors. It had been visited by some intruders before, but they didn't really take much as all these tools were of low quality. That should be it. Normally someone that runs out of stamina will be out for a good 6 to 8 hours. I'll check upon him in the morning. He closed the shed but didn't lock it from the outside. There wasn't anything useful in it, and if Bernier woke up and found it locked he could have a panic attack. Maybe even use it as a toilet if he woke up in the middle of the night. There was nothing in it that he considered valuable, so even if he ran off back to the city it would be fine. His own hose was tightly protected, so there was no fear of someone like this even getting in there. What was a guy like this doing down in the dungeon anyway? His jobs are blacksmith and carpenter. He is level 45, shouldn't he be in some smithy working? Roland had peeked at Bernier's status. He couldn't see his pure stats, so he couldn't compare his old Runic blacksmith class to the regular one, but he could see that this man was a pure crafter. From his perspective, there was no reason to endanger himself to go down into the dungeons. With his skill set, he should have joined the construction company or one of the many smithies in town. Roland shrugged as he hoped to be rid of this half-dwarf in the morning. After dumping him off at the Adventurers Guild he would have a clear conscience. It was already late and he was still wearing his crimson armor. Even though he was complaining about Bernier's smell, he wasn't much better off. Spending a whole day in this type of armor had made him sweat. How he was able to last this long was thanks to his heat resistance skill along with a little rune that lowered the temperature on the inside. First, he made a trip to his secret workshop where he started to remove his armor. This was a bit easier to do than putting it on, so he was done with it faster. He had made a rack from some wooden logs beforehand. It was quite basic but was enough for hanging this crimson armor. After being done with that, it was time to take a bath. He was tired after a full day of work, but not enough to not clean himself. While on the way here he noticed the backpack that belonged to Bernier. The red color brought his attention back to the egg that he received from the boss battle. For some reason, he felt like playing around with it. After taking it out from the large backpack side pocket, he carried it over to his bathroom. While the magic water was filling up his tub and while the magic runes heated it up, he was looking over this ostrich-sized egg. I wonder if this thing is edible. It looked like a giant egg just with a strange pattern. It could be some kind of rare delicacy. The monster inside wasn't like the other dungeon monsters or the ones living out in the wild. This thing worked on some different laws. He could even find a goblin inside of it. There wasn't really a limit on what could be hiding inside, and it defied the regular monster breeding and birthing norm. Read that you could even get vampire babies from these things. He moved into his large tub of water while still holding onto the egg. This tub was quite large to fit his own large frame that was getting more muscular with time passing. He could easily submerge his whole body while being in it. For now, he left the egg floating in the warm water while he washed himself. All the sweat and dirt started to mix together with the soap that formed bubbles around the water surface. It was already midnight at this point, so Roland found himself leaning back in his hot tub while closing his eyes. The monster egg continued floating between his legs without a care in the world. While thinking about the plans for tomorrow, he found himself closing his eyes. Due to his heat resistance skill, he now needed to increase the temperature of this water by a few degrees to feel comfortable. It was probably well beyond what a normal person would be able to stomach, but for him, it was just right. The egg was taken from a volcanic dungeon, so he also didn't think that hot water would cause any long-lasting damage. 10 more minutes and then I'll go to bed, he thought to himself while relaxing, but like times before, Roland found himself dozing off in the warm water. This happened from time to time whenever he overworked himself. The previous day he also didn't get much sleep as he was giving his new crimson armor the finishing touches. Bork. Bork bork boof. Gah. What they? Roland shot up awake only to realize that the sun had already set. The water had gotten cold just like last time when he spent the night in this tub. He was awoken by a strange shout that sounded like his new half-dwarven acquaintance. Did he activate one of the traps? Did he not read the note on the door? Before standing out he heard another thing, a sort of whining noise hit his ears. He looked down to see something red floating around in the tub along with him. Hey! It took him some time to notice that the egg had cracked and that something had popped out from it. This something was now floating in the tub and looking up to him. It was quite fuzzy and its fur was quite red. It had a large black nose and its face was covered with some black stripes here and there. Before he could take another look, the monster started barking again. It was clear that this was some kind of canine monster similar to the hellhounds he faced off during his class change quest. It was quite small, no more than a puppy. Roland quickly removed himself from the cold water while also grabbing the puppy that seemed to have just hatched from the large egg. He held it up with both his hand and used his identification skill to get the name. Ruby Wolf Puppy L1. Can I still sell this thing? He could hear the puppy whimper the moment he uttered those words, as if it knew what they meant. Roland was left now with another problem, but first, he would need to put on some clothes and see what the idiot outside was up to. It seemed like he had activated the electrical trap that gave him quite a jolt. Chapter 89 Dog and Assistant. It was the dawn of the next day. After falling asleep in his bathtub, he was greeted with some new problems. The monster egg had hatched and produced some kind of dog-like creature. If he had to describe it, he would say that it was similar to a wolf puppy with long-standing ears and a longer snout. The other characteristic thing about it was its tail that had a sharp ruby tip. This same tip was now slamming against one of his wooden chairs while the pup was wagging it around. After checking, he also discovered that this child was a male. Hup! He set the passed-out half-dwarf on another chair. This guy had activated the trap at his door, which shocked and paralyzed him in the process. It would take a few minutes till he could move again, so he was nice enough to bring him inside for now. What will I do with you? While Bernier was indisposed, Roland took a look down at the small animal. It was clear that this monster had gone through the imprinting process the moment it hatched from the egg. All of these monster eggs had different requirements for hatching. Probably with the increased heat of his hot tub and maybe the close proximity to him through the whole night, it could have triggered the hatching process. Some of the monsters that hatched from the eggs would see the first living being they come in contact with as their parent. This was the case for canine-type monsters that went off of the smell the most. I don't think I can sell you to anyone like this. Roland gave out a sigh while the ruby wolf puppy gave out a high-pitched bark. The more he looked at the small animal, the more it wiggled its behind. Soon the ruby tip of that tail caused the wooden chair to give out and splinter. It was clear that this was a monster, as a regular dog would not be able to exert this amount of strength. Hey, stop destroying my house, bad dog! He shouted at the puppy that caused one of the chair legs to fly off into the distance. The abrupt shout caused the puppy to whimper while dropping its ears down. Don't you look at me like that! The dog looked at him with his big eyes while whimpering some more. This caused Roland to back away. He was someone that actually liked dogs, but animals weren't allowed in his old apartment. Neither could he get one in this world while being on the run or working to further his craft and earn money. This was quite troublesome, even more as the dog started shaking around. Roland was wondering what this was about, but the puddle that was forming under it made things clear. He quickly grasped the small puppy and started carrying it out of the house with a stream of urine following both of them, as the small dog had quite the full bladder. Did you drink the bath water or something? When he got outside with the little red puppy, the little guy started barking frantically some more. Its ears stood at attention along with its tail as it saw the large space outside. Soon it was barking and running around with no worry in the world. It was a newborn pup, so it was clearly eager to see the new world outside. Roland had quite the large backyard that was fenced off, so he wasn't afraid that this small puppy would get outside. The problem was with the hidden runic mines buried in some strategic locations. There would be one dead puppy if it stepped on one. You'll have to stay with me for the time being. He grasped it with his hand and carried it close to his armpit. The little wolf was then stuffed into a closet so it wouldn't cause more damage. He himself got some water and a mop to clean the urine. The water was filled up with one of his magic wands that produced it. The problem was that he underestimated how long the half-dwarf would be out cold. Is that an enchanted item? Bernier was now sitting upright and looking as Roland poured water into a bucket with a magic tool. I guess it is, what of it? Nothing, it just has a unique design, and are those runes? Did you perhaps make it? For some reason, he could see some sparkles appearing in Bernier's eyes. It was as if he was looking at him as if he was some rare animal. No, what makes you think that? He tried to deflect the question, but it seemed that his secret was out. Bernier kept staring at him with that strange look before shooting up to his feet. He quickly ran over to the bucket of water and then just as quickly dropped down to his knees and started bowing. Please, sir. Take me in as your apprentice. Hey? Apprentice? What are you on about? The surprise in Roland's eyes was clearly visible as he looked down to the prostrating half-dwarf. The youth was also calling him sir even though he was only 16 years old. Though looks were deceptive in this world, as old people could look very young with enough vitality or some special skills. I'm a great worker. I can clean your house, cook, wash your clothes and... Bernier started listing off things that he could do for him before quickly grabbing the mop that he brought over. He soon was cleaning the urine trail that the puppy created for him, scrubbing everything as if possessed by some kind of cleaning demon. Roland was quite astonished by how proficient this young man was at cleaning. Perhaps he even had a cleaning skill that made things easier. I'm not looking for an apprentice, what could I even teach you? But sir, you are Wayland the runesmith, right? The runesmith. Roland's heart skipped a beat the moment he was called a runesmith by Bernier. He was hoping to stay hidden from the world, but he also knew that sooner or later people would associate the wares that he was selling in the auction house with him. What makes you think that? He asked while going to the side while wondering who was talking about his identity. I overheard some blacksmiths talking about new runic equipment in the auction house. I also saw Sir Wayland deliver some items into the auction house. It really is surprising that you were actually the runesmith yourself. Think everyone thinks that you are just an apprentice working here. Don't worry, sir, I'll be sure to clear things out in the city and tell them everything. Dante. The half-dwarf was quite chatty while finishing up the cleaning. Apparently, he was the first person to put two and two together. Sir. I'd like that part to remain private and stop calling my sir. I'm not that old. Who do the people in the city think that I was? This farce had kept on for quite a long time, mostly because people didn't think that a young man like him could be someone producing runic equipment. There just had to be some kind of craftsman working in the background, and this was confirmed by Bernier here. Most people thought that Wayland was him as a runesmith that for some reason liked playing around as an adventurer. But I don't think many people know about you that much. Everyone is concerned with their own things. That might not be the case anymore. He murmured to himself while rubbing his chin. After the little fight he had in the Adventurers Guild, his name would probably be starting to get known around the city. Wayland the adventurer and runesmith might become the talk of the town soon, even more now when he could finally produce deep steel and deep iron items semi-proficient. This would probably be a good time for expanding his wares and earning more money, but it also brought dangers with it. He was just one man. Even though he was stronger now, it would be hard to go against any organization alone. That depended on the people ruining things though. A thieves' guild could be paid off and used for protection if a person knew the right people. Roland wasn't really part of Albrook's inner workings. He had no idea who was running things in the background. The noble and city mayor were the obvious leaders, but there was always someone moving in the background. Lucky for him, the city was still developing and the auction house was safe for making business. The only downside was the steep margins that they charged for his wares. If it was possible to hide his face for a bit more time, he would use it to his advantage. There was no reason to give away all of his secrets. The problem was that Bernier here now also knew that he was Wayland and a runesmith. The people from the Adventurers Guild probably knew this as well. He did show his face to the elven lady while getting his new card. With how things were currently, hiding might not have been an option. If he even needed to do that was still up to debate. It had been some time since he escaped from Edelgard and even longer since he left his old home. It might have been time to let all of this paranoia rest and move on with his life. Don't worry, Mr. Wayland, your secret is safe with me, so please hire me as your assistant. Bernier started bowing his head once more. It was clear to Roland that this youth had lost a lot the day before. The party of adventurers he was working for was wiped away, and this along with most of their belongings. The half-dwarf had craftsman classes that he could see through with the help of his identification skill. He wasn't sure why he would choose him as his master though. The half-dwarf clearly didn't have a mage class, which was needed if he wanted to become a runesmith. There apparently were some ways of gaining mana sense later in your life, but they all required costly items or strange rituals. My assistant? I can't teach you runesmithing, you don't have the talent for it. I'm aware, Mr. Wayland, but I only want to be a regular blacksmith like my father was before me. I can work on my own. I'll even give you back the coins for the materials, so please let me practice blacksmithing. It was unclear to Roland why this youth was so adamant in his resolve. It didn't make much sense to him that he wanted to work for him. There were many other traditional blacksmiths in the city that were also dwarves. He was mostly self-taught and could barely make intermediate-grade armor and weapons. There wasn't much he could teach this guy. He also had just leveled up from his smithing class, so he wouldn't really know much more than this kid. Shouldn't you try the other blacksmiths first? How about Gray? He wanted to mention some of the weapon shops and armor shops that would be better for the youth in the city, but he was quickly cut off. I tried, no one would want to hire me. They wouldn't? Why? Roland was a bit surprised by this fact, as the youth did have a good class distribution for a craftsman. Bernier would make a nice addition to any smithy and could probably be developed into a weaponsmith or an armorsmith soon. No one would want a half-blood like me. Bernier slumped his shoulders forward while dropping his head, while silence filled the room. I see, I forgot about that. There was a certain purity undertone in these lands. Humans, elves, dwarves, and all the other races somewhat looked down on anyone that was considered mixed. He wasn't sure why this was the case with so many races around this world. It seemed that intermingling would be something obvious and natural, but reality here was different. The races would somewhat accept the mixed races, but they wouldn't allow them to prosper alongside them. At least not unless they showed their worth in one way or the other. Roland had kind of tossed things like this into the back of his head. He didn't really adhere to the social norms in this world, as he liked living alone. His introverted tendencies only got worse with time, but now it looked like he might have gained a potential helper. There was also the ball of energy that was barking furiously in his closet. He decided to finally open it and could only see a red blur. It was clearly not used to its own body, which caused it to collide with its new master's leg. Roland just looked down after feeling a small impact against his shin. The ruby hound's head collided with his leg, sending shivers of pain down his spine. The dog flopped on the ground with a wide-opened mouth. Its tongue was right out and it was panting furiously. It clearly didn't react to hitting Roland's leg and causing him pain. This only made him want to punt this unruly dog out of his house. Though after looking at its silly face he wasn't able to go with it and ended up just grumbling. Let's forget about this apprentice nonsense, we should report to the guild about that rare boss. You will probably be able to keep the items of your old party members. I apologize. Roland trailed off but stopped himself from continuing. It's fine, we weren't that close, I wasn't really part of that party. The moment of silence was quickly halted by more barking from the small monster dog, which was then ended by Roland giving the big black nose a prod with his finger. Be quiet. Surprisingly, the dog listened to the order while sitting down. Did it hatch from that egg? Yes, regretfully. Why? It looks like it likes you, Mr. Wayland. Bernier smiled a bit while leaning down. He reached out towards the monster puppy while trying to pet it. The red wolf pup didn't react in kindness though. it bore its teeth at the person trying to pet it while quickly hiding behind Roland's leg. This caused the half-dwarf much pain as he felt something shattering deep inside his little heart. I need to finish that guild quest. Roland gave out a sigh while his house continued to be invaded by foreign sources. He had been living here for quite some time now and the silence was the good part. Now he had a loud dog constantly barking and a half-dwarf that looked like he could jump off a cliff any minute now. If I want to go to the guild I need to put my armor back on. He had disrobed and placed his armor down in his workshop. He had somehow been able to put it on the last time but it was a hassle to get all the straps in. While thinking about this he looked down at the sad Bernier. Bernie, was it? So you want to be my apprentice? Don't move from this spot, I'll be right back and keep that red dog in check. It's Bernier. The young man perked up at the mention of the apprentice role. He remained in the room he was in while Roland went away to fetch something and locking the door behind him as he exited. The little red pup was quick to follow his new mommy but the way outside was blocked by the half-dwarf. The little animal started barking and biting while Bernier continuously tried to keep it from venturing further into this house. While this was happening Roland was down in his true base of operations. He quickly packed up the armor pieces along with the arming jacket. If he was going to have a potential apprentice he would use his presence to the fullest. His secret was partially out in the open and the youth already saw his armor in action as well. This didn't mean that he would show him how to enter his secret workshop. After returning upstairs he found his living room destroyed. The chairs were all turned around and so was the table. He found Bernier wrestling with the small red dog on the floor, which was surprising. "What are you doing here? Help me get this armor on and let us go back to the Adventurers Guild." He squinted at the two people while contemplating if it was such a good idea to keep both of them around here. Chapter 90 Puppy Registration. 4 guards were standing by the entrance gate to Albrook City. This gate had 2 large towers to its sides with even a few archers keeping watch. The whole city was still in the development phase but most of the walls that surrounded the insides were already built. It was early in the day so there wasn't much to do for these guardsmen. They were here to keep immigrants outside if they weren't able to pay. Even now people kept pouring into this city in hopes of earning money and starting a new life. Most of the heavy hitters had been entrenching themselves in the city like the Adventurer Guild and some wealthy merchants. It was now very difficult to start your own business without stepping on the toes of some powerful people, which caused most of the new arrivals to search for work in some of those companies. The day had started off slow with not many new merchants coming in but soon something interesting would come walking by. One of the guards nudged another one that was slowly dozing off on the side. "Hey, get a load of that." This guard gave out a grunt as he was still a bit hungover from the day before. His vision was a bit blurry but soon it focused on the dark red blob in the distance. What the sleepy guard saw was a man in a full suit of armor. "Wait, what is that on top of his head?" the guard asked while squinting. The armor in itself wasn't really that interesting. Many adventurers wore similar ones and even more extravagant looking than this one. What was out of place was a little red wolf pup sitting on this large armored man's head. It had its head raised up high as if it was some kind of proud noble creature. Behind this armored man, there was another person that was smaller in stature and wearing a large backpack. The guards didn't really know who these two were. Roland's fame was on the rise but that didn't mean that everyone in the large growing city was aware of him. He sparsely visited the city and he also went through other armors. This new look was not something that the other residents associated him with. Soon the strange duo with the monster puppy arrived by the gate. Normally the guards would just let Roland through without really asking any questions but this time it would be different. He was bringing in a strange creature into the city. There were certain procedures that needed to be done to allow something like this. "Halt!" the guard shouted, which caused Roland and Bernier, who was trailing a bit behind, to stop. "Is there a problem?" Roland asked while the problem started barking at the guards that he was talking to. Obviously, the guard that was talking to him pointed to the creature on top of his head. This made Roland think back to about half an hour ago. He and Bernier finally decided to set off into the city but then a problem arose. The red dog wasn't having any of it as Roland tried to lock it in his shed. It started barking around furiously the moment he closed the door. This was followed by the sounds of clawing, chewing, and metal tools falling over as the creature started running around the closed shed. It was clear that the wolf pup didn't want to be left in there. The other option was to leave him in the yard that was fenced off or in his house. Both options weren't possible. The area around his house was filled with runic mines against unwanted guests. The inside of the house on the other hand would have probably been chewed to bits. The best option would be to stick it in a small cage through which it couldn't burst through. He didn't have one though, and smithing one into existence would take quite some time. Then finally Bernier chimed in, advising Roland to bring the dog along to the Adventurers Guild. Monsters like this needed to be registered and examined by specialized personnel in the guild. There were classes like tamers and summoners that used monsters for battling purposes. Each new monster would need a permit to be allowed into the city, some that were deemed too dangerous would be banned from entering. Roland was kind of familiar with this process due to him spending some time adventuring now. He didn't look into it too much as he didn't think that he would be an owner of such a monster. At most he might get his hands on a summoning spell rune that he could use for some assistance. Such runes were quite rare and could cost a small house for even a lesser version of it. Depending on the rune type the prices changed even if they were of the lesser variation. "Do you have a license for that beast?" The dog growled menacingly at the guard that was looking at it, but to the man, these sounds sounded rather cute. "No, it just hatched yesterday. I want to register it at the guild." The guard nodded while calling out to another person. There were special people with higher level identification skills at this checkpoint. Such a person was called over to take a look at this puppy. After checking the monster's level and stats, Roland was given some paperwork to fill out. He was a bit surprised that these people were taking things so seriously, but even the smallest monster could turn out to be a calamity if it was untended. They needed to note him down as the owner. If this creature caused havoc in the city, he would be held responsible and would have to pay for any damages. Then if any deaths occurred, he would also be put on trial as if he was the killer. Move along. Something like this would happen each time he came by. Getting that license would be the only way to hasten this process. He also needed to pay a small fine for bringing in an unregistered monster into the city without a proper permit. The only reason it was allowed in was due to it being only at the first level. In this world, monsters had danger levels applied to them, and this creature was judged to be on the lowest of low. That went well, though they didn't need to charge Mr. Wayland a whole silver coin for it. This is clear extortion. "Is that so?" "Bork." Roland replied. His sense of money was a bit skewed compared to the other people here. He was someone that could earn something like a silver coin back with one scroll. It only took him a few minutes to get it done. He actually thought that it was quite cheap to bring in an unregistered monster like this into the city. What if it was some kind of rare poisonous creature that caused a plague? "Quiet down, you." The puppy raised its head high up once more. The only reason Roland allowed this dog to ride on top of his head was because otherwise, he wouldn't shut up. He even tried placing it on his shoulder, but the red ball of fuzz just wanted to be on top for some reason. Was he the wolf pup's master, or was it the other way around? The two young men continued to attract gazes from the people around them all until they arrived at the guild. Roland, thanks to Bernier's help, was able to put on his suit of armor much faster, so he was now thinking that it might not be such a bad idea to get himself an assistant. Roland pushed the door open to get inside and was greeted by the usual looks. Soon those looks turned similar to the ones that the guards showed him. The dog on top of the fully armored man's head was clearly something unusual. There was some luck on Roland's side though, as the usual spot at his receptionist elf lady was free. They arrived early enough for the place to be partially empty, so they were first in line. He was quick to go over to the elf that gave him the silver rank test. "Mr. Wayland, back so soon? Did you take care of the quest already? Want me to call over the butcher to go over the corpses? Oh my, what is that cute creature you have there? Why is it on top of Mr. Wayland's head?" The lady smiled and started going through her receptionist pitch fast before spotting the pup on top of his head. The little guy gave out a loud high-pitched bark which brought even more attention to his master. Ah yes, there is a reason for this. Roland grasped the little pup with both his hands and removed it from his head. The ball of fluff was placed on the receptionist's desk, but he didn't let it go in fear that it would just run off and cause some unnecessary damage. I would like to register this monster, and I would also like to make a report about the deaths of some adventurers. Bernie here was part of that party. He will tell you more about that. It's Bernier. The half-dwarf with the large backpack stepped forward and looked at the elf lady. She nodded with her head while telling the two to wait for a moment. Soon another staff member came out and took Roland to the side. Bernier on the other hand remained with the receptionist elf to give a recount of what transpired the previous day. Mr. Wayland Wright, please follow me. Roland looked at the new person. It was someone that he had never seen before. The man was an old gnome similar in size to the old manager from Edelgard. He had the usual gnome beard and a monocle garnished his face. After following the smaller gnome, he found himself in a separate office. Please place your tamed monster on the table. He followed the instructions and placed the puppy on the table. The inside of this office looked a bit like a smaller veterinary clinic room. On the sides, he could see some large hand-drawn anatomy drawings of strange monsters. There were also some medical instruments here and there. A ruby wolf, quite a rare find. Roland could see that the monocle that the man was wearing was a standard identification tool. With items like that, you didn't really need people with high identification skills. His new dog clearly didn't like to be touched by the other man as he started to bark. The old gnome didn't seem to care much as he continued to look over the small creature while also touching it. Yes, it looks fine. It has clearly imprinted itself upon you, Mr. Wayland, and should stay loyal for now. Is this your first tamed monster? Roland nodded at the answer. It happened by chance. Is there a possibility of it accepting a different owner? He grumbled slightly as he wanted to sell this wolf. Keeping pets was never really his thing. This only brought more troubles to him as he would need to get this puppy up in levels before it became useful. You don't wish to keep it? A high-ranked tamer could probably override the imprinting, but it would be hard to find such a person. The longer you wait, the harder it will be. I'd advise you to keep this monster. It's a rare breed of a canine type. These types always stay loyal to their owners. Its evolutionary options should also be quite powerful if you raise it well. Evolutionary options. Ah, excuse me, I forgot that this is your first tamed monster. Let me explain. Roland raised a brow at the old man that brought his attention to a diagram on the wall. On it there were various monster drawings with arrows. The first one was an egg similar to the one that this monster hound hatched from. These monsters begin with an egg. There are various requirements needed to be taken into consideration to have one hatched, but you seem to have triggered it by luck already. The old man chuckled while pointing to the next drawing that was of a lizard-looking monster. After hatching, the monster will try to form a bond with the first being it comes in contact with. When this occurs, the person that the monster imprints on will be deemed as the creature's master. This allows the master to see their tamed monster's stats, thus helping them track their progress. With this, you'll be able to plan out its evolutionary path. If for some reason a creature hatches without any person to tame it, it will become feral and just act as a regular monster. Roland looked at the small pup. He had previously used his identification skill to figure out its type, but he wasn't able to see detailed stats. I should be able to see its stats. Ah yes, the first time might take time getting used to. You need to access it through your own status screen. Try focusing on it. Roland raised an eyebrow while then bringing up his own status screen. It was easy to bring it up as it came quite naturally. He had learned this skill just by getting transported into this world and getting some of the real Roland's memories. Now he needed to try something else, but when he tried thinking about the tamed monster, another window was brought up. Oh. Name. Ruby Wolf Puppy L1X 0%. Type. Fire/Earth/Beast. HP. 77/77, MP 110/110, SP 136/136. Strength 5. Agility 10. Dexterity 6. Vitality 5. Endurance 9. Intelligence 7. Willpower 10. Charisma 16. Luck 14. I see that you have figured it out. Roland could see all of the advanced statics of this monster. There was also something like a type attached to this puppy but no classes. This was probably due to the monster's name containing its type, which was also more or less its version of a class. Only intelligent beings of the various races in this world were able to have classes. Monsters on the other hand would get evolutions which would always change their appearance in one way or the other. It could be something minor like a change in the color of its fur, or something grand like a more than twice increase in size. Besides the main statics, he could also see the little guy's resistances. His resistance to the fire element was at 40%, while earth was the second highest at 25%. The creature also possessed elemental affinities. He himself still had them on 0%, while this little pup surpassed him in almost all of them. Fire 50%. Wind 10%. Earth 30%. Water 1%. Things like the elemental affinities could later be improved with further evolutions. Higher affinities would empower various skills and magic attacks for the corresponding element. It also looked like the higher tier element affinities like lightning were not showing up at this point in time. He also has some skills. Bite L1 passive skill. Increases the strength of biting attacks. Fiery Bite L1 skill. Discharge of flames during a bite attack. Ruby Tail Whip L1 skill. Skill can elongate the ruby tail of the monster, which then can be used as a means of attack. Enhanced Sense of Smell passive skill. Enhances the sense of smell. Roland squinted at the explanation of the last skill that didn't really add anything new. His pup already had some good skills that he could use. The discharge of flames looked like a good skill, as it probably added magical properties to the attack. He wasn't really sure about the tail attack though. The pup was a bit too small to do much damage with that ruby tip. Though it might work against smaller creatures like monster rats. I think we can safely give you out the license, Mr. Wayland, but if you wish to sell this creature, it would be good to part with it now. The longer it is around you, the harder it will be to break the imprinting. I'm sure we could agree to a good price. Sell it. Roland looked at the red puppy that stared at him back. It was as if the creature knew what the two people were talking about here. Roland could see those big puppy eyes watering up, and it even started to whine. Don't you look at me like that. The more he stared into the eyes of this small monster, the harder it was to make a decision. Soon he finally spoke up while being unsure of what to do. I'll think about it for now. Give me the license. Sure, you'll have to fill out some papers, I'll bring them over. The moment he spoke out, the puppy started wiggling its rump side to side. Its ruby-tipped tail started even smacking into the table the little monster was sitting on. When the old gnome left the room, the puppy decided to jump on Roland's head once more, looking proud and victorious. Stop climbing on my head, you red potato. Borf. The puppy replied while Roland's head rattled from getting his helmet hit by the puppy's ruby tail. Is it too late to sell it? Bork.